I thought I knew what fear was, or that I had known fear. I was wrong. This night I have experienced true fear. The army of the dark is upon us, and it has no end. They march toward us shoulder to shoulder for as far as the eye can see. The very earth must be crying out at the damnable weight of them.
Myth 2: Soulblighter is a real-time tactical fantasy wargame developed by Bungie Software and published for PC and Macintosh in December 1998. Set 60 years after the events of Myth: The Fallen Lords, Myth 2 sees the men of the West once more facing the terrible savagery and sorcery of Soulblighter and his undead legions. Fighting for their lives and homes against overwhelming odds, the armies of the provinces can only prevail through courage, valour, and their own ingenuity. Instead of the real-time strategy staples of base building, unit production, and resource management, Myth 2 follows in the path of its predecessor by focusing purely on tactical action. Players will direct small forces of troops over 3D battlefields where weather, terrain, elevation, obstacles, and even a physics system are all simulated by the game's engine. Soulblighter expands on Myth 1's gameplay by adding several new units and a number of new mechanics, like fire arrows and a mana system. It also refines the level scripting and artificial intelligence of the first game, so Myth 2 features even more varied mission types, such as storming a keep, breaking out of prison, or playing a deadly game of capture the flag. Finally, there are several new maps and game types available in Soulblighter's online mode, which at the time allowed for cross-platform play between PC and Mac users via the Bungie.net multiplayer service. In Myth 2's single-player campaign, mankind will be driven to the brink of extinction, assailed by both horrors from the past and beasts never before seen in the lands of men. In their desperation, the forces of the light will chase rumours of ancient relics from long-dead empires, and find themselves making common cause with the strangest of bedfellows. Myth 2 was a highly anticipated title for fans of the first game, not only for promising to improve upon its single-player campaign and multiplayer modes, but because it was to feature a full suite of modding tools. Bungie promised that both Mac and Windows players would have access to powerful, user-friendly tag and level editing programs, allowing anyone to tailor the game to their liking, design their own single-player missions, and even invent new multiplayer game modes. The original game had been widely praised for its storytelling, 3D battlefields, tactical gameplay, and multiplayer action, and most assumed that the sequel would not disappoint in those regards. And to fans' relief, Myth 2 was released to generally positive reviews, with most major gaming magazines giving it similar scores as the original game. Computer Games Strategy Plus gave Myth 2 4 stars out of 5, praising both its multiplayer additions and diverse single-player missions. On the negative side, the magazine cautioned that the game and its modding tools suffered from a few bugs, that the game's cutscenes were overly cryptic, and suggested Myth 2 was more of an expansion pack than a fully fledged sequel. Computer Gaming World was a bit more positive, awarding the game 4.5 stars and saying it easily met the high standards set by its predecessor. CGW shared Strategy Plus's acclamation of the inventive single-player campaign and was relieved that Bungie had dropped the gesture-click controls of the original, though questioned inconsistencies in the narrative, criticised the game's tutorial for falling short in explaining the control system and new mechanics, and said that the game's friendly AI, whilst better than in the first game, was still problematic. In an aside, reviewer Robert B. Marks, a medieval history student, commended Bungie for modelling some of the basics of real medieval warfare, saying the Myth series was unique in the real-time strategy genre in this regard, but noted the overexposure of swords over axes and polearms, and the conspicuous absence of cavalry on the battlefield. PC Zone gave the game 85% and awarded it their PC Zone Recommended seal, saying that if players could get over its unforgiving difficulty and twitchy AI, they would find Myth 2 an excellent package, combining an enjoyable and well-told single-player campaign with a fun multiplayer mode. Hyper Magazine were especially enthused and gave Myth 2 92%, plus the Hyper Big Rubber stamp of approval, with Dan Toos calling it a wonderful sequel that improved in almost every aspect, defending the lack of major innovations over the first game by saying, "If it ain't broke, don't fix it." Next Generation were more than satisfied with Myth 2, awarding it 4 out of 5 and saying Myth 1's novel 3D battlefields and creative tactical gameplay had been improved in subtle but significant ways. NG remarked that though the Myth series had not yet reached the status of RTS brands like Warcraft or Command & Conquer, it was surely well on its way there. PC Gamer USA were also pleased with the sequel, giving Myth 2 88% and its Editor's Choice Award, noting it retained all the strengths of the first game, though were slightly disappointed by the lack of major improvements to the engine and gameplay. William Harms told readers that though the game was still highly recommended, it carried over the steep learning curve and weak AI of the original, and that many changes were merely cosmetic in nature. Harms observed that if Bungie wanted the Myth series to live a long and successful life, a third title would need both a new engine and more substantial gameplay innovations. Ultimate PC disagreed, sharing Harms' view of the difficulty curve and AI problems, but opining that Myth's revolutionary engine and tactical gameplay still, quote, urinated over its supposedly futuristic RTS rivals. The reviewer awarded Myth 2 90% and said that whilst the game was perhaps not quite as good looking as the upcoming Age of Empires 2, it soundly trounced Mindscape's Warhammer Dark Omen, and congratulated Bungie on having created a sequel that lived up to all their expectations. Internationally, Myth 2 received similarly positive feedback. Reset gave Myth 2 9 out of 10 and said it was a mandatory title for RTS fans, pointing out that there was no need to make drastic changes to a formula that already worked perfectly well. Extreme PC gave Myth 2 89% and said it made a number of improvements over the original, especially in visuals and unit controls, arguing that the only major issues with the game were the friendly AI and lack of in-game soundtrack. Game Over magazine was spellbound by Myth 2's immersive and realistic graphics, giving it 87% and saying that, though not as groundbreaking as the first game, it was a more than worthy successor in storytelling, visuals, and tactical challenge. And Gameland awarded Myth 2 85%, calling it a better, prettier, and more accessible version of the Fallen Lords. Still, as it happened with the first game, a handful of reviewers broke ranks and responded less positively towards Myth 2. PC Gamer UK gave Soulblighter a respectable 80% and credited Bungie for making the most graphically impressive and gleefully bloody RTS on the market. But reviewer Mark Donnell lamented that the problems of the first game remained a major impediment to enjoyment, finding that the game was unforgiving to newcomers, difficult to control, and disorienting. Donnell complained that battles devolved into pseudo-turn-based affairs, as players tried to micromanage their forces through the pause menu and in-game speed controls, robbing them of the fluid, accessible, and exciting gameplay present in many rival RTS titles. Two of Germany's leading reviewers, PC Player and PC Joker, were even harsher towards the game. PC Player gave Soulblighter 75%, impressed by its graphics, novel mission objectives and modding tools, but highly critical of its awkward 3D camera, infuriating friendly fire incidents, and sound design, saying it had failed to solve the weaknesses of its precursor. PC Joker were also disappointed, repeating many of the same criticisms. The magazine praised Soulblighter's multiplayer action, but gave the single-player campaign a mere 69% for its poor AI, bad controls, and muddled tactical gameplay, positing that 3D battlefields and rotatable cameras were an increasingly unwelcome innovation to the RTS genre. None of these criticisms seem to have weighed too heavily on fans of the first game, and Myth 2 quickly met and exceeded worldwide sales for the Fallen Lords, climbing to 350,000 units worldwide by 1999. Soulblighter's multiplayer mode remained a popular haunt for fans long after the game's release, and the game's modding community soon graduated from gameplay tweaks and new maps to full single-player campaigns and even total conversion mods. Bungie would offer unofficial support for some of these projects, and included a number of the most popular Myth 2 plugins in the 1999 boxed set Myth: The Total Codex. In 2000, Bungie were purchased by Microsoft Corporation, and the rights to the Myth series were transferred to Take-Two Interactive, who commissioned work on an official sequel and expanded on Bungie's commercialization of Myth's modding community with Myth 2 Worlds in 2001, which bundled Myth 2 with a number of fan-made mods. Bungie would cease supporting the Myth 2 multiplayer servers in 2002, but the game remains actively supported by the Myth fan community, who have continued to maintain it with unofficial patches and third-party servers. Soulblighter is no longer actively sold either by retail or digital, and today is only available via a physical copy or the abandonware scene. It can be played either in its original form or using the Project Magma fan patch, which includes compatibility fixes for modern operating systems and various graphics and stability enhancements. In today's video, we'll be looking at the history behind Myth 2's development, how it looks, sounds, and plays compared to the original, whether it retained the Fallen Lord's memorable storytelling, and, of course, a rundown on some of the fan-made single-player campaigns that are available to play today. Whether you're a VidMaster veteran or a newcomer to the game, there should be something interesting for you to learn about Myth 2. As always, feel free to watch the video all the way through, or just skip to the part that interests you using the timestamps. And with all that out of the way, let us head once more into the breach.
Then the Chicago office faces one of Bungie's first great challenges.
Bungie has certainly had its share of trials and tribulations.
Welcome to Myth 2, Soulblighter. Do what you're told, and you might live to tell about it.
Working on Myth 2 was one of the big trials.
Click on the target dummies to blow them up.
We ended up having to recall Myth 2 because of a bug.
No.
When Myth: The Fallen Lords entered development in late 1995, it had a number of things going for it. One was its revolutionary height-mapped realistic 3D battlefields, which forced players to adapt their tactics based on elevation, terrain types, weather effects, and the ever-harsh mistress that is gravity. Few RTS titles at the time tried to model that level of complexity, relying instead on top-down or isometric 2D maps and the tried-and-true Command and Conquer formula. Another pro was Bungie Software's inbuilt fanbase, a community of rabid Mac gamers who had supported the company's plans for world domination since their earliest days. Bungie's seventh column could be relied upon to hype up the game in online communities and act as free beta testers and QA staff, in place of paid professionals and all the bureaucracy that came with them. Many of these fans had been active in the multiplayer scene of Bungie's earlier FPS series, Marathon, and the company used Myth as a launchpad for their free multiplayer service, Bungie.net. With the success of the Fallen Lords and Bungie.net, Bungie was progressing nicely along its so-called 7 steps to world domination, recruiting legions of PC gamers into its growing army of fans. But neither Myth's 3D engine nor Bungie's fan base could be taken for granted. Though The Fallen Lords seemed unique when it was previewed in 1996, by its release in winter 1997, the RTS genre was slowly beginning to awaken from its torpor and slouch, sluggishly but seemingly inexorably, towards 3D. This shift was certainly not as pronounced nor as irreversible as the one happening in the action-adventure or first-person shooter markets, but it was happening. Reviewers were complaining that the market had become oversaturated, swamped, as several put it, by Command & Conquer or Warcraft clones. Westwood's official sequel to Command & Conquer, CNC Tiberian Sun, had been delayed multiple times due to internal development problems, and the team's attempts to innovate on the gameplay of the original. And a few magazines began to whisper, hesitantly, that it might seem dated if it remained on hiatus for much longer. There were of course interim technologies and many other ways to keep an upcoming title seem fresh, but to some developers the writing was on the wall. That was certainly the perspective of Activision and Pandemic regarding the Dark Reign series, for example. The first game was clearly influenced by the established 2D giants of the genre and released just before Myth to fairly positive feedback, indeed better than Myths in some cases. Yet the developers of the game's sequel decided that the time was ripe to switch to a 3D engine and lean into the innovations that sprung from that move, later arguing that this was clearly the future of the genre. And in private, other developers were also starting to consider making the move to 3D, including Red Lemon's Tartan Army, dubbed Myth with Skirts when it was announced, and Creative Assembly's Taisho Total War, with many more ambitious RTS titles soon to be revealed to the public. So even with their head start on the competition, Bungie couldn't simply rest on their laurels with the Myth engine. To that end, in 1998 the Myth team essentially split down the middle. Myth's original programmer and creative lead, Jason Jones, returned to the drawing board and began overhauling the engine, originally for the purposes of creating a more ambitious, sci-fi flavoured successor to Myth. Project Monkey Nuts, later dubbed Blam, would feature far more advanced polygonal graphics, environmental modelling, physics, and artificial intelligence, and was intended to be to Myth what Myth had been to Command & Conquer clones. Several other key members of the team went over to that project, whilst the remainder stayed on to develop a direct sequel to Myth under the direction of producer Tuncer Dennis, joined by a few other Bungie staff who had not worked on the series before. Myth 2 was therefore from the start a somewhat safer and less innovative endeavour than the original game, but one that would turn out to hold more than enough challenges for both the Myth 2 team and Bungie software as a whole. Though The Fallen Lords had achieved most of its key gameplay and technological aims, there were several features that had been planned or briefly worked on that had failed to make it into the final game. The most well known of these were AI-controlled wildlife, a simulated 3D fire mechanic, customizable user scripts, flying units, and artillery. Some of these would thus form the core of the improvements Bungie were targeting for Myth 2, alongside more general goals such as more advanced graphics, smarter AI, and better controls. The latter two were a priority for Bungie, as the loudest and most consistent criticisms of the original game revolved around the steep learning curve, unit controls, and friendly fire mechanics. Initially, Bungie had defended these as part of Myth's tactical challenge, that it rewarded careful positioning and skilled micromanagement of your troops. But when Myth 2 was announced, the team bowed to public feedback and took a different stance. In various previews, Bungie admitted that they had overtuned the difficulty of the first game due to having spent so much time playing it internally, and that the constant threat of friendly units getting in each other's way and blowing each other up was a symptom of weak AI rather than an actual feature. The company promised that Myth 2 would offer an even greater challenge to veterans of the Fallen Lords, but that it would also take pains to ease new players into the game, improve friendly AI, and feature more intuitive controls. Early previews of the game responded positively to Bungie's concession, and were generally enthused about the title, paying special attention to its visual and auditory enhancements. In particular, the news that, in a major break with the first game, Myth 2 would feature context-sensitive in-game music. This was an especially exciting feature for Bungie's audio production partner Total Audio, who had won several awards and been singled out for praise for their music and sound design work on the Fallen Lords. All the same, there was no hiding that, whereas the first game had been an ambitious and innovative addition to the RTS genre, Bungie had to actively preempt accusations that the sequel was merely a rehash. with Tuncer Denise asserting that if you have a formula that works, don't mess with it. Getting Myth 2 to stand out from other RTS titles in development sometimes took some creative marketing stunts, such as a cheeky environmental drive in which players who donated copies of StarCraft, Age of Empires, or Total Annihilation for recycling would receive a discount on their purchase of Myth 2. Another was rather more straightforward. In order to help distinguish the game from the avalanche of other titles that would be sent to reviewers, Bungie decided to construct unnecessarily large retail boxes solely for future review copies. But for Bungie's 7th column at least, the team were already showing more than enough to get them hyped for a sequel. This loyal and enthusiastic fan base would be once again co-opted by Bungie, but some of these fans would be doing far more than beta testing and spreading the good word. Though the original Myth was not specifically built for modding, early versions of tools used for level design and tag editing did exist in the hands of a select few outside Bungie, as well as third-party programs developed independently by the fans. Some members of this community would be taken on to the Soulblighter team to work on the game's multiplayer maps. Others would form the nucleus of early Myth modding collectives. The Daimyo project, announced in early 1998, was one of the earliest attempts at not only creating a total conversion for the Myth engine, but also at commercializing such endeavors. Developed at the time for the Fallen Lords, Daimyo would have transported players to feudal Japan, combining the 3D environments, weather effects, and physics simulation of the Myth engine with the battlefield tactics of the Sengoku era, and had procured the services of historian Stephen Turnbull, who would later consult for creative assembly on Taisho. The project would unfortunately run into problems with both the evolving Myth engine and its unnamed publisher, but then fans were not the only ones having issues with the practical side of things. In a later interview with Daimyo artist Charles Holt, Bungie's David Bowman revealed that despite Myth 2 being a follow-up title, the Soulblighter team had struggled with the nuts and bolts of making the game. Bowman cited two major causes for this. The first was that due to part of the original team leaving the series to work on Blam and having to be replaced, some of those working on Soulblighter had no pre-existing experience working on the Myth engine. The second issue was that Bungie were developing the game in tandem with the tools used to modify its content. These editing tools were incomplete and often buggy at this stage of development, and things were made no easier by the fact Bungie were trying to keep the gameplay fresh by pushing the limits of their scripting and artificial intelligence. One level was to be set in an enclosed interior space, but the unit AI in the Fallen Lords was incapable of distinguishing between temporary barriers and solid walls. Another level was to feature a prison break, with units scavenging weapons and items, and guards reacting to loud noises. But the first mechanic took too much time from the animation team, and the second was too difficult to program effectively. Total Audio's Marty O'Donnell would be particularly disappointed with the decision to drop another feature, the heavily promoted dynamic music, which was cut due to memory constraints. Adding to pressure on the Myth 2 team was the relatively short development cycle. Whereas the original game had roughly 2 years put into it, Soulblighter was given a ballpark target of around 9 months, to be in stores by either November 1998 or January 1999, depending on the source. Similarly, Myth had involved 4 programmers and 3 artists, which was small even by the standards of the time, whilst Myth 2 was assigned 2 programmers, 4 artists, and 2 dedicated level designers, all of whom regularly strayed outside their core roles. In interviews, Bungie's upper management indicated that they wanted to avoid the brutal crunch that had taken place on the Fallen Lords, yet it was later revealed that Soulblighter had exacted an equally heavy toll on the small team. Programmer Jason Regier and artist Mark Bernal recalled spending 12 hours a day, 7 days a week in the office, whilst level designer David Bowman cited 80 to 100 plus hour work weeks in the second half of development. Bungie CEO Alex Seropian later admitted that staying until 2 AM was common practice in the final stages of Myth 2's production, an experience employees characterized as horrendous. The monetary costs of developing a game were also a growing concern for Bungie. The company had spent approximately $200,000 to develop Marathon 4 years earlier, but the Fallen Lords devoured over $1 million in production costs. Bungie did have their 7th column fan base to reduce the costs of quality assurance work, but this apparently convenient relationship may well have contributed to later problems for the developer. The 7th column themselves were not a monolithic entity, with one group being loyal Mac addicts and the other rapidly growing faction being PC gamers. Bungie's earlier decision to break with their Macintosh exclusivity had been very successful for the company, but it was not entirely without controversy. The company had supposedly received a few death threats from the more dedicated Apple fans, and after Myth's launch, their cross-platform Bungie.net service had to add an official rule prohibiting arguments over PC versus Mac. The vast majority of Mac players were seemingly happy, or at least resigned to the fact that they were no longer able to satisfy Bungie's needs, but some felt that the move was a dark portent for the platform's future. One Mac magazine noted with some sadness that when the Fallen Lords was being demoed at trade shows, Windows PCs were displayed front and center, whereas Macintosh computers running the game appeared to have been deliberately concealed from public view. All the same, Bungie had made their bones as a Mac developer, and they would surely never betray their roots. But there were other clouds on the horizon, arguably even more concerning than a few disgruntled Mac heads. The mid to late 90s saw the emergence of a new moral panic, not the dungeons and demon worship craze of the 80s, revolving around preschools, Satanism and tabletop gaming, but adapted for a new age, one of hyper-realistic video games in which impressionable children were driven to psychotic rages, or trained to shoot up their high schools.
Isn't making a game and selling it that encourages a kid to point a gun at a television set and rewards his success or her success by increasing the firepower of the gun, encouraging criminality?
In America, the primary targets of this outcry were violent first-person shooters, arcade light gun booths, and fighting games, but other titles, including Myth, would be drawn into the peripheries of the discussion. Bungie had responded to similar criticisms as early as 1996, with public relations head Doug Zartman defending the bloody violence of the Marathon series in a Bungie soapbox editorial, and Myth designer Robert McLeese writing a 1997 article on the merits of realistic violence in games. In some ways, public concern over violent content was a boon to Bungie. It spurred the addition of a no-blood option, which replaced death and gore with colourful, child-friendly alternatives. This feature gave Myth 2 access to more retailers, and made it acceptable to German and Korean rating boards, both of which were notoriously strict about violent content. Even so, the Myth series was still very openly marketed on its pornographic depiction of bloody carnage and explosive destruction, a theme that would later be revisited by critics of Soulblighter. All these potential issues, quality assurance, financial challenges, fan feedback and moral panics, may have seemed distant in mid-1998, but they would be back with a vengeance. Early signs of trouble with QA came when Bungie sent out hundreds of CDs to Soulblighter's beta testers. The response was underwhelming, with Bungie receiving limited feedback from the fan community. What had gone wrong? According to Alex Seropian, the CDs had been sent out with passcode timers that expired before they actually reached testers, meaning that only dedicated fans who went out of their way to call up Bungie's tiny customer service department were able to test these pre-release builds. It's unknown whether these beta testers could have prevented the later event that ensured Myth 2's launch made headlines. Although the final stages of Soulblighter's development were frenzied and stressful, with levels being scripted and tested right up until the last minute, the game was nevertheless finished ahead of schedule in December 1998. Indeed, so conveniently ahead of schedule, some fans speculated Bungie had rushed the game for a Christmas release. Alex Seropian dismissed such claims by arguing that the game was intended for a January 1999 launch, though this is disputed by numerous other sources, most notably the Chicago Reader feature Monsters in a Box, which went into great detail on the repercussions of Bungie's failure to hit both a November 1998 release and then slipping past a December 13th target. But none of this seemed to matter when, on December 10th, 1998, Myth 2 went gold. Press releases were hastily typed up, early review copies submitted, and the discs sent out for mass replication. Despite missing earlier targets, Bungie believed they might be able to ship copies by December 16th, thus reaching pre-order customers in time for Christmas, and North American retail stores by December 28th. Bungie had every reason to be confident, as pre-orders vastly exceeded those of the first game, and early impressions from gaming sites were extremely positive. For all their worries, things finally seemed to have come together, and on the morning of December 28, 1998, 200,000 copies of the game were rolling onto pallets to be shipped to retail stores across the country. But as the trucks carrying their precious cargo roared down America's highways, Bungie received a frantic call from Myth 2's Japanese publisher. The woman responsible for translating the game had accidentally installed Soulblighter to the root directory of her hard drive, and immediately attempted to uninstall it. The process went off without a hitch. In fact, Bungie's uninstall program was so efficient, it promptly wiped the woman's entire hard drive.
Essentially, when you would uninstall the game, it would wipe the directory that you had installed it to. If you installed the game to the root level of your hard drive and then uninstalled it, it would proceed to actually wipe your entire hard drive.
Casualty.
Bungie held an emergency meeting and considered their options. Whilst it was exceedingly unlikely anyone else would replicate the specific steps needed to trigger this bug, it was still a possibility, and one that would almost certainly result in highly negative press, as Stormfront's Pool of Radiance would prove when it was shipped with a similar problem 3 years later. Bungie's upper management warned their partners and the several hundred reviewers who had received review copies to be aware of the bug, and then took the painful decision to recall every single copy of the game that had already been shipped. As nightmarish a process as this turned out to be, by the end of the month, all affected versions of the game had been recalled, and fixed retail copies of Myth 2 were being shipped out again. This very public fiasco was, to nobody's surprise, covered extensively in the gaming press in both late December and early January 1999, and is estimated by Bungie to have cost them approximately $800,000 to fix. But the uninstall bug seemed to have been less deadly to Bungie than one might expect. From a public relations standpoint, many fans and journalists gave credit to Bungie for publicly admitting to their error as early as possible, and for shouldering the burden of ensuring the copies were recalled. There's some debate over whether any copies of Myth 2 actually reached the public with this bug intact. Anecdotal evidence indicated not. And more importantly, it made little difference to either review scores, which were almost unanimously positive, nor sales figures, which by January 7th, 1999 had already exceeded total worldwide sales of Myth 1, and would continue to climb. This good news was slightly dulled by a subsequent disaster less than a week later, a mysterious fire that burned down the Total Audio studio in Chicago, though nobody was hurt and no material was lost. Another, even more unpleasant event occurred just over 2 months later. In April of that year, 2 students at Columbine High School gunned down 12 classmates and a teacher in what was, at the time, the deadliest school shooting in US history, triggering yet another moral panic over, among other things, violent video games. Though once again first-person shooters took the brunt of the criticism, there was a perception at the time that the Myth series might fall foul of the discussion, with a handful of gaming journalists wondering whether Bungie's propensity for violence and mayhem made them a prime target. Soulblighter was mentioned in passing in a handful of letters to gaming magazines, and like most developers at the time, Bungie was occasionally quizzed by mainstream reporters as to their position on the issue. Fortunately for Bungie, the controversy mostly passed them by, at least on that occasion, and it seemed on the surface that Myth 2 had been a rousing success for the company. Windows sales continued to grow, and Mac users seemed to have forgiven Bungie their indiscretion with the PC market, with Soulblighter taking pride of place on many a Macintosh. As the popular reference book Macintosh for Dummies joked, the most cherished and important files to be found on any Mac user's hard drive were undoubtedly those of their Myth 2 installation. Both sides would continue to enjoy slaughtering each other over the expanding Bungie.net service, and Bungie ran numerous competitive and promotional events, such as the Myth World Cup, the 7th Phoenix Rising tournament, or the Mac vs PC platform war, several of these involving substantial cash prizes or priceless artifacts, or priceless to Myth fans at least. There were also further positive signs pointing towards Myth's potential as a transmedia franchise. In June of 1999, Bungie and Steve Jackson Games jointly announced that the latter would be publishing a tabletop role-playing rulebook under the title GURPS Myth, which translated the world of Myth to Steve Jackson's generic universal role-playing system. But the book included an unusual addition, a guide for translating GURPS to video game form via Soulblighter's modding tools. It was these tools, the tag editor Fear and map-making program Loathing, that arguably did more than anything else to ensure Myth 2's legacy. The Daimyo project, which had begun in the Fallen Lords engine and later switched to Soulblighter, never made it to completion, but it turned out to be the forerunner to a vibrant modding scene for the series. The whole reason GURPS Myth had come about at all was that two Steve Jackson staffers had fallen in love with the game and spent hours tinkering with the modding tools. The very instant the tools had made it into the hands of the public, bugs and all, the community started churning out multiplayer maps, cheat mods, comedy physics plugins, unofficial rebalancing patches, palette swaps, new units, and more. Third-party tools to complement these were also developed, and soon the modding collective had graduated to scripted single-player missions, importing graphics from other games, and full-length campaigns. The most active modders would coalesce into large map-making collectives like Badlands, Vista, and Creation, whose members would then sometimes break away and form their own groups. Bungie quickly capitalised on the potential of these, promoting some of their favourites through official channels and offering hands-on assistance with a few. Probably the earliest and best known of these latter cases was the Badlands Collective's Chimera, released in November 1999. Originally pitched to Bungie as a commercial project in the vein of Daimyo, Chimera was downscaled to a free single-player level pack, made by fans but with a little help on the side from Bungie. Total Audio's Marty O'Donnell helped consult on the project's sound design, and a number of Bungie employees served as amateur voice actors for various characters, including O'Donnell himself, Fallen Lords lead Jason Jones, CEO Alex Seropian, and several others. Bungie also helped promote Chimera as an unofficial expansion to Myth 2, and hosted it on their website. Chimera was only the first of many major projects that would be developed for Soulblighter, with names like Blue and Grey, World War II Titans, and Green Berets earning fame within and without the fanbase. There were controversies too, of course. Some multiplayer tournaments were marred by accusations of cheating, and the relationship between different modding groups was sometimes less than entirely friendly. But the Myth series seemed to be riding high on its retail success, multiplayer community, and active modding scene, and in November 1999, Bungie announced Myth, the Total Codex, which packaged the first two games with their official Cybex strategy guides alongside the Fear and Loathing tools, the unofficial Chimera expansion, and a compilation of other popular third-party plugins. And this wasn't even the peak of Soulblighter's modding scene, which had many other exciting projects in the pipeline. At the turn of the millennium, Myth seemed Bungie's crown jewel, and more than one magazine speculated that even with all eyes turned to their upcoming Blam, now dubbed Halo, it was inevitable that Bungie would return to the Myth series one day. So it came as a shock to many when, in June of 2000, Bungie formally announced that they had consented to acquisition by Microsoft Corporation. Bungie would be relocating much of the team from Chicago to Redmond, Washington, and more importantly, they would be transferring the rights for the entire Myth franchise to Take-Two Interactive, who prior to this had owned just shy of 20% of the company. As with the story around any such major deal, the motivations behind Bungie's decision to give up their independence, and the cherished Myth series, has been subject to various explanations. A common theory was that the December 1998 recall of Myth 2 had been far more damaging to the company than was previously thought. Alex Seropian had admitted in many earlier interviews that despite Bungie's success, they were always potentially one flop away from the end. Contextually, the Myth 2 recall had cost Bungie almost as much as the entire development budget for the first game.
Just that one action of not wanting our customers to have their hard drive erased cost Bungie about $1 million.
Boom! That'll teach them.
And being a small independent publisher, that was a lot of money. We ended up selling a small stake in the company to Take-Two, actually, just in order to get development capital. And from that point on, there was always sort of this knowledge that we weren't invincible.
In an FAQ released to the public, Bungie cited the fact that, quote, "The business of publishing entertainment software has changed enormously since Bungie started," using this as one of the two leading reasons Bungie had agreed to the Microsoft purchase. Bungie stated that though the company had not been in immediate danger of going under, it implied that there was significant uncertainty as to Bungie's future beyond that point. Marty O'Donnell, who had joined Bungie as a full-time employee 10 days before the deal went through, has denied that the Myth 2 recall was the main reason for the decision to sell the company, but he said that it did contribute to a, quote, "cash flow concern." Other commentators have pointed fingers at the costs of developing Halo, or problems over Bungie's California office, whose first and only title, the anime-inspired action game Oni, had been delayed multiple times. Whatever the reasons for the sale, it was a blow to many, in particular the Apple fanbase, and not just rank-and-file Mac gamers. According to one source, the deal resulted in newly crowned Microsoft CEO Steve Ballmer being subjected to a furious late-night phone call from Apple chairman Steve Jobs. Jobs, who had promoted Bungie at Macworld and declined an earlier offer to purchase the developer, was apparently unaware he was in competition with Microsoft for the company, and like many Mac gamers, viewed the deal as a knife in the back. But the Myth community were obviously the most affected, with the franchise soon to be out of the hands of its loving parents and into the claws of a major publisher. Ironically, though perhaps unsurprisingly, apprehension over the series' future often centred not around Take-Two, the new owners of the Myth franchise, but rather around the potential influence of Microsoft Corporation, despite the deal rendering the latter with no influence over the Myth series at all. Leading fan site myth@bungie.org characterised the deal as, quote, "bullshit," and later declared that Bungie's Jason Jones, and whoever else was responsible for the acquisition, should burn in the fiery pits of hell. The leading Myth modding host, The Mill, announced that it was shutting down, reportedly claiming that Microsoft's legal counsel had demanded the closure. In their letter to fans, Bungie specifically called out the site's accusations and denied that they, Microsoft, or any other party to the deal had anything to do with the Mill's abrupt termination. They also assured the Myth community that the existing Bungie.net servers would continue to support the Myth series for the indefinite future. Regardless, many key figures in the community were upset by the news, with more than one claiming they had lost all passion for both Bungie and the Myth series, which was now subject to the wicked whims of its new masters at Take-Two. Others decided to stay the course or remain optimistic about the series' future. The Mill quickly came back online, having been acquired by Tuncer Denny's Mac Game Files, and 2 years after the release of Myth 2, the modding community was still going strong, with projects even larger in scope and scale than Chimera still in development. Where Take-Two took the franchise is a story for another video, but they clearly shared Bungie's belief in the value of promoting Myth's modding scene. Aside from the oft-forgotten Myth 2 Green Berets release, the publisher would release one more major entry in the Soulblighter saga. Myth 2 Worlds, launched in October 2001, included the base game, its strategy guide, and more importantly a compilation of some of the largest and most expansive Myth plugins developed to date. These included total conversions like the Seventh God, Jinn, World War II Titans, and Bushido, plus many popular maps and smaller mods. Those 2 CDs, packed with custom content, were a physical reminder of the combined tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of hours the Myth 2 modding community had poured into the game. Bungie's decision to package Soulblighter with the Fear and Loathing tools hadn't just generated a wealth of new content for the game itself, but also inspired many to embark on a career in games development. Craig Goodman of the Green Berets project, for example, joined Mumbo Jumbo and the Myth 3 team, and is today working at Insomniac Games. Similarly, the Badlands Group's Christopher Barrett progressed from the Chimera project to a full-time job at Bungie, and was the game director on the recent Destiny 2. And several other developers not associated with Bungie or the Myth series have credited the Myth 2 map-making tools as having spurred their move into the industry. Whilst many figures retired from the Soulblighter modding scene, for others it remains their passion to this day. Even after the release of Myth 2 Worlds, other major projects were produced by the community, including Project Magma's The Fallen Levels, which ported the first game to Myth 2, and Golden Circle's Myth 3 Public Beta, which recreates the entire campaign of Myth 3 in the Soulblighter engine. The value of Myth 2's modding community was perhaps most obvious in 2002, when it became clear that neither Take-Two nor Bungie would support the series forever. When Myth 2's legacy was threatened by technical issues, namely compatibility issues with newer operating systems and Bungie's shutdown of the Myth 2 servers, the two companies would collaborate with the fan community to help keep the Myth games accessible to players old and new. The story of how Myth was kept alive by its fan base would be a long and probably controversial tale in itself, no doubt failing to credit many of its key figures. But the two main groups associated with Soulblighter's more recent history were the now-defunct Myth developers, who were given access to the source code and archives to the Myth series by Take-Two and Bungie, and the Project Magma Collective, who remain active today. As with most groups associated with Myth's modding, map-making, multiplayer and unofficial fan patch scene, there was often overlap between these two groups, and no one entity can claim full credit for the game's continued longevity. Though as of 2022 the Myth franchise is dormant, and even its modding scene, though active, is not as busy as it was a decade ago, there's much to be said of both Soulblighter and the many mods it spawned. To give the game, and its fans, their due, let's begin with how Myth 2 plays, and how it compares to its predecessor. Myth 2's campaign is structured in the same manner as that of the original game, about 24 distinct single-player missions and 2 hidden levels, all of which are totally independent from one another. The number and composition of your troops depends on the mission. Sometimes you'll be controlling 30 men or more, sometimes only a handful, but the typical size of your forces is around 15 to 20. The objectives for each mission can vary wildly. One mission might ask the player to escort a townsman from one end of the map to another, protecting them from numerous ambushes by the forces of the dark. In another level, your objective is simply to defend a valuable structure against waves of enemy forces. Success means progressing to the next mission alongside any surviving veterans, meaning the units you receive in the next mission will be more experienced and perform better than on-seasoned troops. One way in which Soulblighter differs from the first game is that it actually recognises veterancy across the entirety of the campaign, so even if some troops are absent in one mission, they won't be deleted from the game, and can still return in a future mission that includes the same unit type. This means that certain units can make it from the start of the campaign all the way to its conclusion. The majority of units from the Fallen Lords return in its sequel, with the player controlling the light side faction and the AI controlling the dark. The basic trifecta of warriors, archers and dwarven bombardiers remains the same, so players will be using many of the same tactics they developed whilst playing through the original campaign. That means blowing up hordes of strong but sluggish thrall with the dwarves, peppering soulless and explosive kamikaze wights with fire from your archers, and protecting softer units from opportunistic ghouls with your warrior units. You'll also witness your foes pulling their usual tricks, like hiding undead units underwater, splitting their forces to flank you, or descending upon your forces from above. However, several new units have been added to both the light and dark factions, sometimes straightforward upgrades and other times filling in a previously unused niche role. So whilst the light side retains the swift and ferocious berserkers, the dark no longer have access to their undead cousins, the myrmidons. The Myrmidons have been replaced by 2 even more dangerous unit types. One is a slightly slower but far stronger and sturdier ogre-like foe, who can weather much more damage, defeat most light units one-on-one, and still chase down archers or dwarves. The other replacement for the Myrmidon retains the original unit's speed, but is far more savage, with much faster and more damaging melee attacks, their only minor weakness being a propensity to go feral and attack anything nearby when their health becomes critical. And whilst the lightning-throwing fetch once again ally with the dark, another unit type called the Warlock can be found on the opposing side, with the ability to toss slow but powerful balls of magical fire at enemies. As in the Fallen Lords, the Light will again have to contend with traitorous or ensorcelled human troops, though in Myth 2 these are now distinct units with slightly different statistics: the Dark Bowman and the Brigand. There are a handful of other new units joining both the Light and Dark factions, both as core troops and unique individual characters, but those are best left for players to discover themselves. Functionally, where some of these units differ from the first game is in the mana system and special abilities. Whereas in the Fallen Lords, magic attacks were either on a straightforward cooldown or a limited resource, in Soulblighter several magic units now have a rechargeable mana pool, allowing them to use their abilities whenever they wish, so long as they have enough spell points available. There are a few new spell types and special abilities in the Myth 2 campaign, but the three most commonly used will be the Fire Arrow, Binding, and Confusion abilities. Archers can now launch flaming arrows at the ground, which, depending on the terrain type, can quickly spread to nearby patches of ground and rapidly drain the health of any unit standing in it, as well as potentially set off incendiary devices. The Binding spell will permanently convert any mortal enemy to the player's side, allowing them to command that unit for the remainder of the mission. Finally, the Confusion spell does exactly what it says on the tin, causing all enemies in a small area, at least those with some semblance of a brain, to become disoriented and wander aimlessly or randomly attack nearby units. Although the general control scheme is much the same as the first game, Bungie made some small changes to both the controls themselves and the way units move and interact with each other. Bungie said their number one priority in this area was first letting players control the game entirely with the mouse, so mousing over a unit will quickly show their current health and status, holding down the right button will change their orientation, and an extra panel is added at the bottom of the screen that lets players pick formations and other common commands. This leads into the second major change, which is units bounding boxes and collision detection. A common problem in the Fallen Lords was units getting in each other's way or boxing other units within their own formations, which resulted in chaos and frustration in the heat of battle. Although positioning is still important in Myth 2, units are now much less sensitive about their personal space, and can slip between each other a bit more easily. So though it's still better to use looser formations for skirmishers and ranged units, warriors and berserks will have an easier time moving between their lines to meet oncoming assaults, and props or inaccessible terrain are less likely to cause traffic jams. Another way in which the game was made friendlier to new players was the addition of a mission objective and hints panel. This not only tells players what they should be doing, but also provides mission-specific hints and access to more general reminders to help them make the most of their options. And another, blunter method of easing the pressure was to rework the overall difficulty levels. The original release of Myth was heavily criticised for its lower difficulty levels being too harsh, so Bungie have taken both the lowest and highest difficulties to their extremes. Timid and simple difficulty are recommended to new players, giving friendly units significant stat bonuses and reducing both the number of enemies present and certain scripted ambushes or extra waves of assaults. Legendary difficulty, on the other hand, has now been tuned to be even more punishing than in the first game. Other small but useful additions include better AI pathfinding and target selection, reducing friendly fire incidents, and extra options for the in-game speed controls, so players can fine-tune the game's pace to match the severity of the situation. Other changes to the gameplay are on a case-by-case basis. Thanks to having more time to experiment with Myth's engine and scripting, Soulblighter's designers were able to introduce more unique elements to each level. In an early level, you can catch a band of guards unaware and prevent them from summoning reinforcements. A few missions on, you'll have to split your forces to overtake a traitorous nobleman, whose castle is riddled with secret escape routes. In another mission, a massive enemy force is slowly marching in pursuit of your small band of survivors, so you'll sometimes need to sacrifice safety for speed and break through enemy lines before their main forces catch up. And much later, when executing a prison break, your forces have to dodge enemy patrols, reclaim their special gear, free companions, and set up ambushes to block messenger runners. Several levels also feature extra gear scattered around the map, such as rare plants that can be hacked apart for healing routes, or an artifact resting just out of reach. In some cases, these scenarios were prototyped in the original game, but the level of control designers were able to exert in Myth 2 allows for more complicated scripts and reactive enemy behaviour. Myth 2's gameplay will thus be very familiar to veterans of the Fallen Lords campaign, but with a few twists added to mix things up and provide new challenges to their established strategies and tactics. In the video I did on the original Myth, I talked quite a bit about the novelty of 3D battlefields in a real-time strategy game, but also how it seemed to me that in the end, Myth's big selling point ended up having a fairly limited impact. In Computer Gaming World's preview for Soulblighter, Joe Vanilla confidently asserted that the Fallen Lords 3D battlefields symbolised the beginning of the end for traditional 2D RTS. But as we saw, that turned out to be untrue. Or, at least, if traditional RTS were dealt a death blow, it was not by Bungie's hand. 2D titles continued to reign supreme, and the apprehension over Tiberian Sun and Age of Empires refusing to step into the future was apparently unfounded. Several 3D titles, such as Pandemic Dark Reign 2, were flops, whilst Blizzard's ambitious plans for a 3D role-playing strategy were mostly scaled back to focus on traditional RTS gameplay. But in that video, I was looking at things with the benefit of hindsight, something developers at the time were not blessed with. As we saw in the behind the scenes section, in 1998 there was an increasing demand for RTS games to shrug off the chains of 2D worlds and provide something new. When Ion Storm's Dominion limped onto the market that year, it was practically laughed out of the room, with Ultimate PC arguing that it illustrated how true 3D terrain offered superior tactical depth, and anything less than that was no longer going to cut it. The Fallen Lords was one of the few titles at the time to offer that upgraded experience, but the year of Soulblighter's release, there were plenty of other upcoming titles taking advantage of 3D worlds. Bullfrog's long-running Populous series was making the switch to 3D with Populous the Beginning, as was its younger, naughtier sibling, who was also getting the 3D treatment in the form of Dungeon Keeper 2. Whereas in 1997 upcoming 3D RTS regularly courted comparison to Myth, moving into 1998 there was a noticeable decline in shout-outs to Bungie's title. There were more exciting, or at least more recognisable 3D titles in development by that point. Common points of reference included Pumpkin's Warzone 2100, LucasArts' Star Wars Force Commander, and in particular Relic's Homeworld. Several of these games were arguably doing no more to innovate in 3D than Myth had already, maybe even less, but they nevertheless eclipsed Myth as the standard point of comparison. By the time of Soulblighter's release in December 1998 or January 1999, most gaming magazines had stopped using the series as a benchmark for 3D RTS. One reason for this wasn't really anything to do with gameplay, but simply that post-Myth, 3D games were also making use of 3D polygonal models instead of 2D sprites, and the whole concept of a fully 3D game was only partly rooted in objective technological standards. Unlike Myth, some of those games actually looked fully 3D, whatever the term actually meant. But there was more than a kernel of truth to the idea that the Myth series was falling behind as an innovator. Relic's Homeworld may have retained the good old base building and resource management of the pre-Myth era, but just as the Fallen Lords wowed with its height-mapped 3D battlefields, Homeworld blew reviewers away with the idea of units being able to occupy practically any visible point in space. Instead of archers arranged in lines on a hill, fightercraft would adopt three-dimensional claw formations, or strafe their foes from above and below. Moreover, whilst Myth defended its totally linear level-based single-player campaign as the price of unique missions and good storytelling, Homeworld promised the same, but with a quasi-persistent campaign that kept track of more variables and allowed the player to choose from various side objectives. Several magazines became instant evangelists for the game even before its release, trumpeting that this was the real future of RTS. Myth couldn't complain too bitterly about losing its claim to fame as the flagship 3D RTS. Some felt the Fallen Lords had inflicted the same injustice on Cavedog's Total Annihilation back in 1997, but it was indicative of the state of RTS at the time of Soulblighter's release. Myth was a series that had just a year earlier been heralded as cutting edge, but was now more like comfort food for its fans. So at the time of release, the features Bungie promised for Soulblighter, more advanced scripting, varied mission objectives, and mission-specific mechanics, were arguably an apology of sorts. It was an admission that, no, Soulblighter wasn't really innovating in any measurable way at all when it came to core gameplay, and had to rely on gimmicks instead. But on its own merits, as cheap bags of tricks go, Soulblighter does have some amusing distractions. The complexity of some of the enemy AI and level scripting in Myth 2 is pretty impressive, particularly when they intersect with each other. In the mission set in the Baron's castle, you can see the AI try to make a break for one of the escape routes, but then stop and retreat when they see your forces try to intercept. Or you might see the Baron and his escort trying to maneuver into a spot that lets them slip past, occasionally sacrificing a wave or two of their guards as a distraction. And the prison break level has quite a few moving parts too, with the player sometimes having to wait for a large enemy force to depart, then slip in and kill the guards, rescue their allies and retreat before the enemy returns. Another mission set underground is basically one big playground for the level designers, subjecting the player to a relentless campaign of meticulously scripted harassment by ghostly tricksters. But otherwise, most of the behaviour you'll see from the AI is identical to that of the first game. The enemy repeats the same tactics they used in the previous war, like hiding Thrall and Wights underwater, or making goals advance and retreat based on the proximity of your melee troops and what direction they're facing. As I mentioned in the behind the scenes section, Bungie did try to experiment with other features, like escaped prisoners scavenging weapons, but nothing all that revolutionary to my knowledge. Bungie claimed that their new moving 3D models, like drawbridges being raised and lowered or gates swinging open and closed, offered new tactical challenges, although to be honest these aren't really any different to energy barriers or foes emerging from caves in the Fallen Lords. We've certainly seen it all before. One mission revolves around the novelty of a destructible bridge, but there were other RTS at the time who had destructible bridges as a standard feature. The general beat-to-beat quality of the enemy AI is also very close to the original game. It does seem like enemies are slightly better at prioritizing targets and not being tricked by bait units, but this will vary depending on how much time each individual level designer had to fine-tune things. There are some cases of fiendishly cunning Soulless and Thrall, and then completely brain-dead human enemies. And you'll still find plenty of ways to break their AI. In fact, you'll probably be relying on it on legendary difficulty. So it's slightly better than the Fallen Lords, if we're being kind. The new unit mechanics are also a bit underwhelming as innovations go, as the mana system is really a tweaking of the previous system. And whilst the idea of a fire system sounds interesting, in practice I never found it particularly helpful. It's just too unreliable to have any effect on your general tactics. I feel like it would have been more useful if it could have burned down patches of forest or something like that, to punish enemies or players who like to exploit the cover of trees. Thinking back to that Computer Gaming World review, Robert Mark's point that Myth could have used some cavalry units to spice things up is well taken. In a Q&A, Bungie said they experimented with cavalry, but they disliked how they looked when navigating the 3D terrain. I suppose another difficulty is that Myth is a relatively small scale game, and some of the fastest units can already cover ground at a good clip. Anything faster than that could be difficult to control or respond to effectively, since they'd probably spend half their time out of view of the camera. Instead, Bungie added a few variations on existing units, some slightly stronger, some slightly faster, some with longer range, but nothing that substantially changes how you play. The Warlock unit's confusion spell is a useful form of crowd control, but you only get to play around with it for a couple of levels. Two of the other units, the Brianor and the Wolves, only appear in a single level out of the entire campaign, which seems like an inefficient use of the designers' and artists' time. I suppose they partly exist for the sake of multiplayer, but it does give the impression, accurately I think, that the Myth 2 team just wanted to throw as many things at the player as possible, and hope nobody complained about the underlying mechanics feeling stale. In that regard, what Bungie really pushed in their pre-release marketing for the game was how much more accessible and less frustrating the core gameplay experience would be for both veterans and new players.
Welcome to Myth 2, Soulblighter. Do what you're told, and you might live to tell about it.
In some ways they were successful, but in other ways their attempts backfired and made things worse. I think most people, but certainly not everyone, would agree Myth 2 softening the RNG element of the original game was a good move. The militia archers are generally a bit more accurate than the Furbolg of the first game, which lore-wise is a bit strange, but fair enough. And the dwarves' explosive projectiles are both more accurate and less prone to misfires. There's definitely an element who will miss the hilarity of Molotov mishaps from Myth 1, but the original game hinged so heavily on RNG, whether a Molotov bounced back in your face or a single arrow missed an approaching fetch, that it promoted save scumming even on the regular difficulty. In terms of the difficulty levels, it's hard for me to say how much Myth 2 departed from the original system, as I don't recall playing the on-patched retail version of the first game. Anecdotally, the normal difficulty of both patched Myth 1 and on-patched Myth 2 struck me as pretty similar once you got a reasonable way into the campaign. One thing I do notice replaying it today is that Myth 2's legendary difficulty does seem to match Bungie's promise of being an even greater challenge than that of the Fallen Lords. Both games are extremely hard at this difficulty. I've only ever completed legendary no casualty runs by shameless abuse of the speed controls and reload menu. But 2 definitely seems harder, even if it's for the wrong reasons. Once again, legendary difficulty is more about prescience and exploiting deficiencies in the AI than tactical genius. I watched a few Mythmaster vids of the level landing at White Falls, for example, and players 100 times more skilled than me still resorted to tricking the AI into blowing themselves up, rather than playing it quote-unquote legitimately. But one of the biggest problems with the AI is that your own units are still painfully slow-witted. Bungie knew that friendly fire was a major complaint with the first game, and insisted they'd improved it in Soulblighter, but they only got halfway there. Once again, friendly fire was a persistent complaint in reviews of Myth 2, and most would agree it was a legitimate one. Dwarves are better at picking targets than before, and are less likely to blow themselves up, but will still toss explosives at a lone enemy already mobbed by a score of your own warriors. And sometimes it seems like they're a little too cautious, refusing to arc projectiles over friendly or hostile units when it seems like there shouldn't be anything stopping them. Funnily enough, the improvements in the dwarf AI make the shortcomings of the archers even more obvious, as I was gritting my teeth over the bowman in Myth 2 far more often than I did in Myth 1. It doesn't seem to me as if there's any appreciable improvement in archers' abilities to pick their targets intelligently, so expect to see them pouring shafts into the backs of both your melee units and each other with great regularity. They seem particularly prone to loosing into each other when positioned on different levels of elevation, though this was always an issue with AI in the Myth engine. But the changes to formations and unit spacing are another major and unexpected problem with Myth 2's controls. What probably seemed like a no-brainer that everyone was asking for, letting units move through each other more easily, turned out to have some drawbacks. In the original game, it was often frustrating to see units refuse to slip past each other when there was clearly ample space to do so. On the upside, it meant that units were usually standing far enough away from each other that they could be easily picked out from each other in the middle of battle. Because groups of units, especially melee combatants, tend to clump together in Myth 2, it's often difficult to tell how many there are, or their individual status. There are several times in Myth 2 I lost track of a unit because they were obscured by a compatriot, or failed to notice that a vanguard fighter was near death and should have been moved to the back. I suspect this issue is what spurred PC Gamer UK and 2 German reviewers to characterise Myth 2's camera and controls as messy, confusing, or disorienting compared to traditional isometric or top-down RTS. I don't think they were correct in characterising this as a symptom of 3D camera controls though. Whilst it's certainly easier to lose units behind obstacles on a 3D battlefield, I've played more than a few isometric RTS games where putting a bunch of units in one big mob makes it difficult to pick out individuals. So on the whole, Myth 2 made some very minor improvements to the overall experience, but not enough to make a major difference. Still, maybe it's a mistake to take Bungie at their word in the first place. As much as Bungie insisted in their marketing that they wanted to make the game more welcoming and accessible to newcomers, did they really expect to snag anyone other than veterans of the Fallen Lords? It's likely they didn't mess with the formula, as Doug Zartman put it, because they knew 90% of their audience were people that already liked and enjoyed the Fallen Lords, warts and all. With no major innovations and competitors starting to overtake them in the RTS market, Bungie's target was probably people like me, who enjoyed the single-player campaign, and maybe to an even greater extent online players, who are more likely to keep using Bungie.net. I can't really say anything to the experience of the latter, as I've never been the net gaming type, beyond that Bungie apparently got their wish, as Soulblighter retained and grew the Fallen Lord's multiplayer audience. In some ways this perspective is woefully deficient, since a huge chunk of Soulblighter players, especially those watching this video, probably remember the game better for that rather than its single-player campaign. So revisiting that campaign with lowered expectations, it does make more sense. If you consider the general pacing and balance of the campaign, it's more like an expansion you roll on into right after finishing the first game. The opening level is less a primer for new players, and more a joke played on veterans, as the paralysing ghasts seem like discount thrall until you notice your warriors being frozen in place. The subsequent levels, where you start encountering dark variants of your own units, again seem like a twist to throw off returning players, rather than the ideal tutorial for first-timers. This continues into the mid-game, where players used to bombing the sluggish thrall with their dwarves suddenly find themselves overtaken by swifter, hardier pigmen. That several levels in Soulblighter are variants on those from the first game reinforces this perception, as is the fact that some of the new enemies are sort of like copies of those from the Fallen Lords, but with an unpleasant twist. Granted, it's not an especially gripping topic for critical analysis, but it does fulfill the design philosophy of Myth 2. We know what you like, so here's more of the same with some processed cherries on top. Which is, conveniently enough for this video, exactly what Bungie delivered with the production values. Whilst in 1998, polygonal 3D graphics were much more common than they had been in Myth 1's day, the trade-offs inherent in real-time 3D graphics were as stark as ever. So though using 2D sprites on a 3D battlefield may not have been the sexiest talking point for marketing purposes, it meant Bungie could repeat Myth's trick of combining smooth and detailed 2D sprites, 3D worlds, and lots of units on screen at once. As with the Fallen Lords, Myth 2's units were first rendered as high-quality 3D models, created in Alias Power Animator according to a developer article, and then converted to 2D sprites for use in-game. The major two differences with Soulblighter's sprites were that the units had twice the number of animation frames as the first game, and here's a dirty secret anyone who's put them side by side will know, they're actually smaller than the originals. Although most of the units from Myth were returning, the fact Bungie had to revamp them meant that they decided to touch them up a bit, so you'll notice a few differences between the Myth 1 and Myth 2 versions of the same units, aside from the size and animations. Early previews also claimed units in Myth 2 would use a wider variety of animations, and if you watch very early trailers for Soulblighter, it seems as if Bungie at least attempted this. Units appear to have both walking and running animations, whilst some have different attacks to the final game. I have a vague memory of reading that Bungie had experimented with these ideas whilst developing the Fallen Lords, so maybe they decided to give it another shot early on in Soulblighter's production. In the final product, there's no evidence of these extra animations, so I'm guessing Bungie ran into memory limitations or just didn't like the way they looked. In the Myth 2 handbook, it's also stated that the idea of units swapping weapons was too demanding on the artists, so I suppose having all these alternate animations for every unit would have fallen into the same trap. I can't quite put my finger on why, but honestly I preferred the models in the Fallen Lords. It could be nostalgia, or it could be that the camera was zoomed in closer and the models were bigger, but whatever the reason, I think the units in Myth 1 looked better and had more presence. One area in which there was a pretty unambiguous upgrade was the polygonal landscape meshes used for each level. These had 4 times as much fine detail as those in the Fallen Lords, which apparently meant it was possible to represent far more subtle delineations in the terrain, like tiny mounds or furrows in the earth. Another improvement over the Fallen Lords was in props and structures. Once again, true polygonal 3D models were used, but in Soulblighter many of these are also animated. Drawbridges can be raised and lowered, gates swing open and closed, unearthly edifices waver and deform. Now, Bungie claimed this was a totally new feature, but I do recall one or two animated polygonal structures in the Fallen Lords. I suppose it's possible this was some kind of special effect rather than the model itself changing in real time though. Certainly in Myth 2, both the animated models and the environmental effects are much more lively than before. You'll see fish leaping out of water, autumnal trees shedding their leaves, windmill sails whirling in the breeze. But for those who don't want to stop and smell the roses, there are also some impressive examples of structures blown to pieces or collapsing under fire.
They blowed up real good.
There's an entire secret level that's basically just there so you can detonate mass hordes of wights and watch buildings explode, though it's anyone's guess as to why so many of these animations are saved for this one hidden level rather than spread out through the campaign. Polygonal models are also just generally more common overall. In Myth, a single large 3D structure was often the centerpiece of the whole map, but in Soulblighter's campaign there are whole maps littered with them. In theory, this should be an improvement over the first game. In practice, I'm not so sure. Some people might just prefer the more desolate environments of the first game, but I also think the quality of these 3D models is distractingly low compared to the colour maps that are used to represent the landscape. If you take a returning location from the first game, the City of Covenant, the structures in the first game looked more natural, more organic, despite their lower quality. Statues deformed by age and neglect, or perhaps mauled by fire and magic a generation past, or the rubble of ancient halls of learning. In Soulblighter, the city has been rebuilt, but manages to look worse to my eye. The structures are too clean and angular, or to put it another way, they're too spiky and too plain. The former problem is probably exacerbated by Soulblighter having a higher maximum resolution, so the boundaries between the colour maps and 3D objects don't blend as well as they did at Myth's 640x480 muddiness. This may have spurred PC Player and PC Joker's criticisms of Myth's 2D and 3D assets not blending together too well. In some levels, like the castle interior, there are areas where 2D sprites and 3D models are packed together side by side, which makes them stand out more than on an open battlefield. The latter problem probably stems from the fact that lower quality texture work in the Fallen Lords could be subconsciously excused as appropriate to the setting. In the mind's eye, muddy textures are just the result of an old landmark being heavily weather-beaten or defaced by rampaging ghouls. But in Myth 2, you know you're just looking at the product of early 3D graphics. Some structures do look good and blend into the landscape quite well, but these are often a blend of 2D colour maps and 3D models, which is a trick the first game used just as well. That's not to say Myth 2 didn't improve on 3D models at all. Due to technical limitations, the original game doesn't have anything like the keep exterior, the galleon, or the fortress at White Falls. These designs can only exist in Myth 2 due to the more subtle variations in the landscape mesh, and the greater reliance on polygonal models. And Soulblighter introduced visual effects that were not present in Myth 1 at all, like roiling seas and variable water elevation. A lot of other effects are just minor upgrades, including better shadows and reflections. But one change to the visuals was apparently so subtle most players and reviewers seem to have missed it. The original Myth included FMV cutscenes created by animation studio Canuck Creations, whose cartoon style, described by reviewers as Disney or anime-like, wasn't entirely to everyone's tastes. In the Cybex strategy guide, Bungie's Alex Seropian claims they went with the studio because they thought this cartoon style was a better fit for Myth's atmosphere than pre-rendered 3D animation, though in a different interview he claimed the decision was made because pre-rendered animation was too expensive. Whatever Bungie's motivations the first time around, they were apparently unsatisfied with the critical response, and for Soulblighter the cutscenes were handled by the more experienced Tokyo-based Anime International company. I always took it as a given that this studio handled the FMV for Bungie West's anime-themed Oni, and Oni's credits do list an AIC as being responsible for their cutscenes, which I assume is the same company. Seropian seems to have been happy with AIC's work on Soulblighter, saying their work was more cutting edge, rougher edge as he put it, and that it made the action and movement in Myth 2's cutscenes look more fluid than in the first game. If you look at reviews of the time though, many don't seem to even be aware of the change, or just didn't think it made any noticeable difference. Those most likely to acknowledge it were the same reviewers who had also run previews for the game, when Bungie were playing up their new Japanese partner as part of Myth 2's marketing, such as Hyper Magazine, who said that though the old cutscenes had a rough charm, AIC's authentic anime work was top-notch. But at least 2 reviewers felt the move was a downgrade, with Strategy Plus arguing the new style looked more Speed Racer than Myth, and Ultimate PC remarking that the Japanese style did not travel too well to a Western setting with Western character designs. I can see the merits of these arguments, as there are certainly reviewers who criticised either Myth 2 or both Myth 1 and Myth 2's cutscenes for looking out of place. Personally, I think they look very good, especially the opening. I'm not sure I'd say I prefer them over Myth 1's, but I understand Seropian's comments about their fluidity in motion. The only objective criticism I think you can level at the visual side of these cutscenes is that in a couple of cases they don't match the in-game art. Scenes of events from both Myth 1 and Myth 2 depict biomes that look nothing like those you actually play through, nor do they seem to line up with the art from mission briefings or after-action reports. Maybe the cutscene versions are in fact how Bungie envisioned these levels, or maybe there was just a bit of miscommunication between Chicago and Tokyo. But changes to the environments and atmosphere of Soulblighter weren't just visual. A more sophisticated addition that went beyond graphical enhancements was the wildlife. Several of the earlier levels feature AI fauna milling about in the background, like squirrels scampering between trees, and eagles soaring over the battlefield. These creatures will also react to nearby units, so expect to see deer shy away from your warriors as they stomp through the undergrowth. Visual or not, all these new features did come at a performance cost, and due to its higher minimum system requirements, such as a whopping 32 megabytes of RAM, back in '99 I had to beg my parents to upgrade the family PC to play Myth 2. Some of the demand being put on systems of the day didn't just come from graphics and AI, but also changes to the sound design, elements of which turned out to be too much for the engine to handle. The Fallen Lords quite rightly won fame and several awards for Total Audio's excellent audio effects, and players were again treated to ear candy like the thunderous footfall of the trow or the bassy detonation of dwarven satchel charges. The new effects are just as good. When a warlock unleashes a fireball, every stage of its life is distinct, from the sizzling of its summoning to the patter of flaming debris upon its explosive expiration. Marty O'Donnell says that the Fallen Lords engine couldn't actually handle moving sounds, that an individual sound had to have a specific point of origin. So, as I understand it, a projectile attack could have a starting point and an ending point, but the sound of its flight couldn't be appropriately modelled. Soulblighter's engine could represent this, improving both the fidelity and accuracy of 3D sounds. But as O'Donnell noted, something that was repeated from the first game was prioritising the readability of the sounds, which meant making them instantly recognisable, so players could understand what was happening on the battlefield from sound alone. Total Audio also made upgrades to the background noise. Ambient sounds in the game world are now in stereo, and Soulblighter supported both Creative's EAX and Oriel's A3D audio effects, like echo and reverb, plus quadraphonic surround sound for those with the setup for it. Another iconic feature of the Fallen Lord's sound design was its voice acting, and the vast majority of this cast returned for Soulblighter.
I'm telling you, those were standard charges for 25-pound mortars.
But they were cannons.
But what were they set up like mortars for then?
Hey, did any of you just hear something?
Roger Mueller reprised his role as Ulrich, Jeff Morrow as Soulblighter, Tony Macas as the warrior, Bob O'Donnell as the surly dwarf, and so on. Jeffrey Charlton Perrin also returns as the voice of the narrator, and some of the minor roles were filled in by Bungie or Total Audio employees. But there was another returning feature that was greeted less warmly, at least by Marty O'Donnell. Myth was unusual among RTS for not playing background music during its missions, and this feature, or anti-feature I suppose, is sometimes perceived as part and parcel of the Myth experience. But as I mentioned in the behind the scenes section, Bungie actually saw this as a glaring omission, and repeatedly promised that Myth 2's campaign would include dynamic music. Although many fans might see this as heresy, I can think of a couple of reasons this might have been important to Bungie. First, contemporary reviews had differing reactions to the lack of in-game music in The Fallen Lords. Some had no particular opinion, some thought it added to the realistic atmosphere, and some were overtly critical, feeling it made the levels lifeless or the sign of a limited budget. Bungie were responsive to common criticisms of the first game, so the more negative reactions to the lack of in-game music may have spurred them to action. The second possibility is that it was Marty O'Donnell himself that was pushing for this, as one of the things O'Donnell enjoyed most about working on the Myth series was being a trendsetter in blending storytelling with music. O'Donnell wasn't a fan of the looping tracks used in games like Command & Conquer, but he was keen on matching the music to the mood.
Go! Just sit right down and you'll hear a tale of a pimping trip that started from the seaside, put aboard this pimping ship. Aboard this pimping ship.
In the Myth 2 handbook, O'Donnell seems especially disappointed that context-sensitive Red Book audio didn't make it in, saying in 1999 that 150 megabytes of in-game music were thrown out. It's interesting to imagine what Myth 2's campaign would have been like with this feature, though as far as I'm aware, nobody outside of Bungie has ever heard these tracks. In the Charles Holt interview, O'Donnell says that beta versions of the game still had it. I assume he means internal betas, rather than those sent out to the 7th column. It may well be that these tunes were reused or adapted to later Bungie games, though I'm not aware of anyone having since commented on the topic. If any Bungie fans know differently, be sure to leave a comment. Still, although Soulblighter copied the first game in restricting music to the cutscenes and pre-mission narration, it's not used in exactly the same way. Although many people have fond memories of the Fallen Lords briefings, those in Myth 2 have a couple of differences. The first and most obvious is that rather than looking at a time-worn map, art was added to illustrate Charlton Perrin's narration, presumably representing sketches made by the journal writer. Myth 1 did actually have art created for this same purpose, but for some reason it was never implemented into the final game. The second difference is that even though context-sensitive music is absent from the levels, the briefing music has been scored to more closely match the narrator and on-screen visuals. This makes the narration in Myth 2 feel somewhat more like an authoritative, narrative-driven cutscene, rather than the musings of a lone soldier, though whether this is a genuine improvement over the first game's style of storytelling is something we'll come back to later in the video. Of course, what hasn't changed from the first game's music is that it's just really good overall. Several tracks have a far more unambiguously triumphal tone than anything in Myth 1, which again we'll talk about later, but there are plenty of tunes covering a wider range of feelings, from despair to dogged determination. Once again, Myth 2's soundtrack was treated to both an official commercial release by Bungie and later as a free download courtesy of O'Donnell. As with the first game, the latter was yanked from O'Donnell's Bandcamp sometime in 2021, likely over legal issues, but it isn't too difficult to find out in the wild, lawless hellscape that is the internet. But if you're a new player, experiencing any of this in the first place would be rather difficult were it not for Myth's fan community. As of writing this review, the entire Myth series remains unavailable on digital distribution sites. Retail copies of the original game or one of its regional re-releases, such as the Total Codex, Green Berets, Myth 2 Worlds, Antologia and so on, can be acquired easily enough, but being neither a native DOS title nor officially updated for modern operating systems, getting it running could pose a challenge. I was personally able to get the latest official version of Myth 2 working on Windows 10, but based on what others are saying, this is a bit hit and miss. Luckily, if you acquire a copy of the game, the Project Magma team have ensured that you shouldn't have any issues installing and playing it. I won't get back into the history of the Myth developers group, informal agreements with Take-Two regarding source code and such, as I completely missed that era of Myth 2's history, and it's a little difficult to establish a clear timeline. All you need to know is that there are a series of highly regarded unofficial fan patches available for Myth 2, not only making the game compatible with modern systems, but also adding features like true widescreen support. Over time, these patches added experimental options like alternative renderers or motion interpolation version to mimic smoother animations, but focused heavily on compatibility with Bungie's official releases. At the same time, Soulblighter was enhanced so as to allow map makers and modders to try some new things out, like creating levels that exceeded previously hard-coded engine limitations. As of October 2022, the latest patch is version 1.8.4, directly from the Project Magma site, which also hosts a free demo of Myth 2. In my video on the Fallen Lords, I said that whilst playing it on the Myth 2 engine with some mods made it effectively 95% identical to the original gameplay experience, I also didn't see much issue with the official 1.3 version, if you could get that working. With Myth 2, we're looking at an upgraded version of the same game, not a port to a different engine, so I don't even have that minor quibble. Although I'm not an expert on the subject, as far as I could tell, the 1.8.4 patch plays pretty much the same as I remember the original game, even including the same scripting and engine quirks. Moreover, both the surviving multiplayer community and active modders migrated to these later releases, which are concerns that you didn't really need to consider with the Fallen Lords. Certainly, die-hard purists are welcome to play Soulblighter in its original form if they can get it running, but for everyone else, I have no qualms at all at recommending Project Magma's version of Soulblighter. As someone who played Myth 2 for years, 1.84 feels exactly like the official release in every way I can think of. But my memories of Myth 2 are very much dominated by its storytelling, something I have mixed feelings about in the context of the first game. So in the next section, let's go over the story and consider exactly what it did differently to the Fallen Lords. The world of myth is a world governed not by men, nor even by monsters, but by the passing of a great comet. Every 1,000 years, a blazing light appears in the sky, heralding either an age of peace, learning, and contentment, or an age of bloodshed and tyranny. This great cycle, where the world belongs to the light for one age, and to the dark in the next, is as inevitable and inviolable as the passing of the seasons. Yet few know of this cycle, and none truly understand it, for there is little care for such matters during an age of dark, and the knowledge attained during an age of light rarely endures into the next cycle. To those precious few scholars who know of it, the cycle of the comet is a source of both dread and reassurance. Dread because every age of light will always turn to one of darkness, and reassurance because one day that light will return. Such an event happened but 60 years prior to the events of Soulblighter, when the legions of the West and their allies defeated the Sorcerer King Balor and ended the Age of Darkness. Balor and his lieutenants, the Fallen Lords, had plunged the world into a nightmare that seemed to have no end. They scoured the great empire of the Cath-Bruig from the face of the earth, overran the dwarven homelands, and put the provinces of the West to fire and sword. It was only towards the end of that long war, when the forces of the light rallied around the free cities of the north, that the tide began to turn. 9 Avatara, wise and powerful wizards, took command of the surviving legions and struck back against the dark. The fallen Lord Shiva fell in a dream duel at Madrigal. The Watcher was obliterated upon the swampy banks of the River Gjol, and Balor himself was beheaded in the ruined city of Rhiannon, his once terrifying visage carried to the Great Devoid and tossed into the endless blackness. Upon Balor's death, the armies of the Dark were broken, and the last Fallen Lords hunted down by the surviving legions. Soulblighter was destroyed at the Great Devoid as he tried to retrieve his master's severed head, whilst the Deceiver fell with the remainder of his army at the Stair of Grief. It was a hard-won victory, for even the free cities of the north had eventually succumbed to the irresistible hordes of the dead and the damned. But it was a victory all the same, for the Fallen Lords had been vanquished and the Age of the Dark was ended. The survivors of the war set aside their swords for ploughs and pruning hooks. embarking on the task of rebuilding the West. The Avatara Ulrich, architect of Balor's defeat, took up the crown of Madrigal, and the new kingdom prospered under his rule. Though the ancient forest giants returned to their trees, and the Furbolg archers to their homes in the Ermine, some dwarves did not go back to their homelands, instead lending their skills and expertise to the men they had fought alongside during the Great War. It is now 100 years since Balor first marched out of the unknown East to wage war on the living, and there are few alive who remember such days. Though the Cathbruig Empire remains a distant memory, civilization endures in the provinces, who have not only rebuilt the cities of the West, but expanded across the Cloudspine Mountains and founded new settlements on the frontiers of the old empire. Several such communities pepper the open countryside west of Forest Heart, where, in the balmy heat of August, one very bored and very tired soldier jots down his thoughts on the events of the day. The journal writer is part of a force patrolling the frontier regions, men and dwarves who spend most of their time driving off bandits or making sure the peasants pay their taxes. These soldiers serve under the Legion commander Kruniak, whose instincts the writer believes are more suited to politics than military matters. The local nobility have expressed their concern at recent reports of grave robbing in the area, and Kruniak, perhaps hoping to earn their favour, orders his forces to investigate these reports with all possible haste. The writer is sceptical and laments that the life of today's soldier is far from those who served in the Great War against the Fallen Lords. But our narrator will discover he couldn't possibly be further from the truth. Kruniak's forces arrive at the town of Willow's Creek and witness a sight that few of his generation have seen before, a horde of the walking dead, animated by foul sorceries. After destroying the horde and rescuing the survivors, Kruniak's men are warned that the undead originated from a nearby cemetery, from where a large force of brigands and bandits have been operating. These men are unusually well armed and organised, and have been raiding the area to kidnap townsmen and steal cartloads of corpses to ship out to an unknown location. In their campaign against the brigands, Kruniak's forces discover that the plan is orchestrated by the mysterious Baron Kildare, whose hired hands are abetted by the very same undead legions that once served the Fallen Lords. Battling dead men and dark magics, the warriors of the provinces storm the Baron's keep and slay him, but discover he was merely the pawn of a greater evil. It was not the Baron who directed the dead legions, but the Fallen Lord's Soulblighter. Soulblighter was not slain at the Great Devoid, but instead fled to the far east, to the untamed lands where he first learned the secrets of black magic, and performed the ritual self-mutilation that granted him eternal unlife. In the 60 years since Balor's defeat, Soulblighter has learned much of the history of our world, from the ancient races that once dominated the land, to the prophecies of the comet and the cycle. Soulblighter has returned with grim purpose, again not to conquer, but to destroy, and the western provinces are ill prepared for him. Kruniak's forces flee to the Cloudspine Mountains, where the dwarves manage to rebuild the same magical gateway they destroyed during the Great War. Escaping back to the west with moments to spare, the survivors warn King Ulrich of the threat from the east. But for many of the free cities, this warning comes too late. Soulblighter's armies bear down on Madrigal with unnatural speed, shattering the legions sent to stop them and destroying everything in their path. To many, it seems as if the Great War is being played out once more, but this time there is no grand alliance of the light. No forest giants to hold the passes of the Cloudspine, no Furbolg to blanket the sky with their arrows. Of the 9 Avatara who outwitted the Fallen Lords with their knowledge of the Forgotten and the Forbidden, only Ulrich remains. Instead, it is Soulblighter who has spent his time studying the past and gathering allies to his side. The Fallen Lord has unearthed magics that even Balor did not know of, and reinforced his undead legions with both savage raiders from the east and a race of nightmarish beasts once thought mere legend. 60 years after the comet was spotted in the sky, there is no age of peace, but once again burning cities and rivers of blood. Perhaps the age of the dark is not yet over, and the victory over Balor was not the end of the war. Or perhaps there is an even more terrifying possibility. that the world is no longer governed by the cycle of light and dark, and is instead destined to endure an eternal night, an age of darkness unending, of blasted lands and mindless undead forever ruled by the Fallen Lords. But if this is true, if the cycle has been broken, then perhaps the rules that governed the contest between the light and the dark no longer hold. King Ulrich decrees that if the terrors of the past are no longer relegated to history, then neither should its virtues. For if evil can return, so can lost glories. And it could be that those who once served the masters of on life can today stand with the living and the light. At the time of its release, The Fallen Lords was given credit by many commentators for both its setting and its storytelling. It was a world that was both fresh and familiar, featuring fantasy tropes that were at once recognisable, but also original and engaging. Surly, thick-bearded dwarves shared armour and axes for explosive Molotovs and dirigibles, whilst Dark Age Norman knights marched alongside shamanic Mesoamerican mystics. Bungie CEO Alex Seropian has credited lead Jason Jones for much of this world, describing him as one of the most voracious readers I've ever met, and in other interviews described Myth as a blend of almost every fantasy trope imaginable, from the lumbering treemen of J.R.R. Tolkien's books to the claymore-wielding madmen of Mel Gibson's Braveheart. In a Chicago Reader feature, Bungie's Doug Zartman cited the noirish dark fantasy novel The Black Company as the model for Myth's storytelling, which, like The Fallen Lords, was narrated from the perspective of an ordinary soldier drawn into a conflict between magi and monsters, a battle of demigods and dark sorceries that was beyond the comprehension or capabilities of the simple fighting man. The Fallen Lords did not tell a story of heroes and villains in the traditional manner, but rather in the form of a fragmented journal, scribbled down by an author who gleaned what he could of events based on rumour and anecdote. It was an unusual way to recount the events of a fantasy conflict, told with an equally unusual tone of bleakness and resignation, far from a hero's journey and the triumph of good over evil. But it wasn't a story that pleased every reviewer, with some critics calling it disjointed or disorienting, unsatisfying, incomplete, and even amateurish. Soulblighter's credits list 4 writers, including Jones, despite the latter having moved over to Blam, but in other sources it's stated that individual level designers came up with their own ideas as they fleshed out the events of each mission. On paper, Soulblighter seems to follow the same model as The Fallen Lords, right down to the journal writer, but Bungie appear to have shaped the story and the way it was told according to player feedback, to both the positive and the negative. As I mentioned in the Fallen Lords video, fans of the storytelling were as fascinated by what Bungie didn't say as what they did, and speculation was rife regarding the identity and motives of the Fallen Lords, the Avatara, and the barely mentioned figures at the periphery of the conflict. Fans wanted to know more about the lost civilization of the Trow, or the nature of the terrible Mircridia, but Bungie wisely held the answers close to their chest, implying there was a grander tapestry of events yet to unfold. How much of that tapestry was phantasmal is a matter for the Myth 3 video, but at the time only the most cynical fans knew better. In making a sequel, Bungie faced not only those loyal fans hungry for more details, but also the same reviewers who would describe the Fallen Lords as unnecessarily cryptic. Some of these details were actually delivered before Myth 2 even hit shelves, with the official Tales of the Fallen Lords comic featuring short stories about the old Trow Empire and the Dream Duel with Shiva. When Soulblighter was released a few months later, it gaveth with one hand and removed with the other, simultaneously ripping the veil off certain elements of the Myth world and teasing new ones. This helped contribute to the idea that Bungie were not simply making things up as they went, but were operating from some sort of definitive Myth Bible that already laid out, if not the future, then at least the past and present of the Myth world. But it seems like there was definitely a heavier focus on introducing the new than illuminating the old. Many of the most hotly debated elements of Myth's story, like the identity of the mysterious head or the unnamed Fallen Lords, remained unanswered, whilst other background elements of the lore, the outer dimension of the Fetch or the elder races wiped out by the Trow, continued to confound fans. The Fallen Lords got away with its evasiveness for two reasons: because it was the first game in the series, and because of its conceit of the story being told in fragments of a soldier's journal. Myth 2 continues to withhold important details about the world in which it's set, but this time around the ploy is starting to feel a little strained. A cynical person might suggest that many of the mysteries of the Fallen Lords were never any more than an interesting name or premise that hadn't been given much thought beyond that. Not that I'd ever suggest such a thing, of course, but if you read fan theories or browse websites like Bungie.org, the most popular topics of discussion are overwhelmingly events that took place in or were first introduced by the first game, not the second. Even though Soulblighter introduced new races or ancient artifacts never touched on in the first game, they don't seem to have inspired a whole lot of speculation, either because fans didn't find them as interesting as content in the first game, or because Bungie were putting the cart before the horse and trying to force players to care about new material when they cared more about the old. But that's not to say Bungie didn't part the blinds on anything from the backstory of the Fallen Lords, as those who've played Soulblighter's campaign will know. Myth's manual and narrator repeatedly dropped references to a sort of historical boogeyman, a race of monsters who terrorized the entire world, devouring entire civilizations until they were spirited away by a convenient deus ex machina. Bungie's decision to make that legend flesh in Soulblighter's campaign wasn't something I personally found to my liking. The first issue was that any time you take something that was once the realm of the mythical and make it mundane, you risk ruining the far more effective image people had built up in their imaginations. In the Fallen Lords, this race of monsters sounds almost too awful to be true. An enemy who could only be matched by larger-than-life heroes and unimaginably powerful sorceries of a forgotten age. So to see these creatures jogging around as 2D sprites on the battlefield is inevitably a letdown. Though the units are themselves quite powerful, they certainly don't strike you as the creatures that once made prey of entire empires. If this new enemy had simply been hand-waved as beasts from the untamed eastern lands, or something like that, I don't see how it would have made a difference to the story. I suppose one of the reasons Bungie used this trump card, so to speak, is that the internal logic of the story relies on Soulblighter's invasion being swift and devastating, to explain how the western provinces can be brought to the brink of annihilation after 60 years of rebuilding their cities and replenishing their armies. This plot point by itself grated on some. I read at least a couple of contemporary reviews whose tone was along the lines of, "Here we go again," when talking about the single-player campaign, since it seemed like Soulblighter was using the exact same setup as that of the Fallen Lords. But that aside, the problem with using the good old trope of an ancient evil returning to the world is that it conflicts with another important aspect of Soulblighter's premise. In the Fallen Lords, the apocalyptic invasion of the Dark was met with a grand alliance of other races, including hermit kingdoms and even old enemies of the West, since the world was facing total destruction. In Myth 2, it's stated that most of these old allies have drifted apart, and are unwilling to get involved in Soulblighter's invasion of the West, since it has nothing to do with them. This is a very hard argument to swallow. The idea that veterans of the Great War of Light and Dark wouldn't care about the Fallen Lords resurfacing seems absurd, especially when you take into account that on at least 3 different occasions, Soulblighter does something potentially world-ending, any one of which should be cause for the Furbolg or the Forest Giants to intervene. Were Bungie trying to make the war seem more regional than that of the first game? Or were they trying to make the opposing sides more morally ambiguous? If so, I don't think they pulled off either too well, but I also think the reasons for that are partly due to another departure from the Fallen Lords, namely how the story is told. As I mentioned, on paper Soulblighter is using the same approach as Myth 1, in having the story delivered by the journal writer. As before, this isn't the sole vehicle for storytelling, since there's also the in-game events and the more traditional FMV cutscenes, but the bulk of the war plays out in the pages of the journal. It was in this that the influence of Glenn Cook's The Black Company was most evident, as the journal told of events from the perspective of an individual soldier, not a court historian. The journal writer wasn't chronicling the history of the Great War from start to finish, but instead began writing towards the tail end of the war, scribbling down what he could in between lulls in the action. The broad strokes of the war from that point onwards are evident in his writings, but anything outside the author's own experience came from campfire rumours or whatever details the 9 Avatara chose to share with those under their command. Even those events that took place concurrently to the journal entries were often relegated to a couple of lines, irrespective of their relevance to the overall war effort. Players might know how many sheep and pigs were traded by the villagers of Crow's Bridge, but they learned almost nothing of the fall of Madrigal, the retrieval of the Eblis Stone, or the civil war in the West. The narrator would sometimes consciously draw attention to the fact some pages were deliberately out of order, covering events that were only revealed to him at a later point in time. Myth's story shifted around 3/4 through the campaign to focus on Ulric's desperate gamble to end the war, so it did encompass the most important beats of its final stages, but overall it was simultaneously a satisfying but deliberately incomplete account of the conflict. Myth 2's story is not like this. Though again told by a single man who wasn't always present for the events he is recounting, this narrator's account of the war against Soulblighter is far closer to a definitive history than a mere soldier's journal. In Myth 2, virtually every major event of note is covered by both the pre-mission briefings and the in-game action. The re-emergence of Soulblighter, the retrieval of the Total Codex, and 3 other key events, the Resurrection, the Restoration, and the Redemption, all of these happen before the player's eyes and are put in context by the narrator, devoid of any ambiguity. Whilst there are certainly a few side stories left untold, how Soulblighter uncovered his 2 major allies for example, or several battles the journal writer was not involved in, these are pretty unimportant compared to the titanic clashes and turning points of the Great War that Myth 1 left to the imagination, and there are no gaping holes in the timeline affected by desperate flights from the enemy. The Fallen Lords ended with plenty of material that could, theoretically, have been the basis for further expansion packs, though these events probably work more effectively as unsung stories. But after finishing Myth 2's campaign, I'm not sure there's a whole lot more that needs to be covered. In this way, Myth 2's narrative ploy, the journal, seems almost redundant, as Soulblighter's story seems far closer to a typical fantasy war story, and may as well have been told in the style of Warcraft or the like. It also leaves Soulblighter defenseless against criticisms that Myth could have hand-waved as being the price of its unique style. Things that were perhaps inconsistent, ambiguous, ill-defined or incomplete in the Fallen Lords could be played off as virtues, as tantalizing tidbits of the innumerable acts of horror and heroism that were lost between the cycles of the ages. Myth 2, in pursuing, and I think attaining, the goal of a more structured, clear-eyed style of storytelling, has to be judged as such. A more straightforward, unassuming, and frankly unremarkable tale, one that leaves little to the imagination, for good or ill. Myth's story lingered after the telling, but Myth 2's is, to put it kindly, in no danger of overstaying its welcome. But this still doesn't address the issue of Myth 2's story seeming both a rehash of the first games and, paradoxically, a less tonally consistent one. If Myth 2 followed in the Fallen Lord's wake by using the Black Company as a model for its storytelling, it also shared that game's omission of the moral ambiguity in Cook's work. To repeat what was said in the Myth video, the Black Company was less light versus dark and more grey versus dark. Plus the protagonist was on the dark side, and the grey side might have unwittingly been even darker than the dark. It got a little bit convoluted. Although Bungie insisted they had drawn from Cook's amoral world, in which the protagonist's side had no moral high ground over their opponents, as Doug Zartman put it, this wasn't really true of Myth, which certainly featured infighting and treachery, but was still essentially good versus evil. Myth 2's conflict can be boiled down to the same dichotomy, the only blurring of these lines occurring in the early stages in which some men are fighting for the dark, and the mid to latter stages when old enemies ally themselves with the light. The former wasn't new. The Fallen Lords featured a level in which you assassinate a treacherous mayor, and another in which your own men were magically compelled to fight against you. The latter, dark fighting for light, was a bit of a twist, as whilst the Fallen Lords were prone to infighting in the first game, they spent the entire campaign bound to the service of the Leveler. This is why I was wondering earlier whether Bungie had intended to push this idea further, to have the light and the dark, which are synonymous with good and evil in Myth, fracture and cross over with each other. Maybe this was why we have elements of a more regional conflict, the Furbolg and the Forest Giants refusing to get involved, for example, and the whole early game plotline with the Baron and the Brigands. But if so, this is only ever flirted with, because Soulblighter is still very much a war between good and evil, it's just some of the bad guys switched sides. One character conjures up the idea of the war making for strange bedfellows, though perhaps not quite as literally as the Black Company used the phrase. This half measure, with the dark being both a lesser and greater threat than before, being both unwavering in the service of darkness and yet also open to alternatives, means some elements of the plot are somewhat implausible and undermines the apocalyptic dread of the first game. I can excuse Myth's reduction of the Great War to good versus evil, because it lends itself to the melancholy, almost hopeless tone of the author, as he fights to salvage something from a war the light has already lost. Myth concluded with the writer deciding to bury the journal beneath the earth, in the hope that even if he and his fellows fell that day, something of their story would be preserved, would live on afterwards, even if they did not. You can imagine the whole story of Myth told through this lens, a curious tome that is unearthed by chance at some indeterminate point in the future, long after the war and its participants had faded from history. In Soulblighter, the journal is in fact rediscovered by the sequel's narrator, but it only brought to my mind how much weaker Myth 2's story is. It seems to me that a sequel to Myth had ample opportunity to adopt a more Cookian perspective on morality, since Myth's ending implied the Fallen Lords were defeated and the entity binding them to the service of darkness was gone, at least until the next age. With the Cathbroig Empire destroyed and every city of the provinces sacked, maybe the world in the vacuum of the Great War could have been one of petty tyrants who emerged to fill the power vacuum. No doubt those fighting men who lived in such an age would have needed employment as badly as their employers needed them. And no doubt the dark powers and people that survived the destruction of the Fallen Lords would have been equally valuable. Instead, Myth 2's story is about a good and just King Ulrich and the upstanding soldiers of the province, forced to battle the same evil as their grandsires did generations past. All very standard fantasy stuff, with the same whiff of stale air. Maybe Bungie didn't want to be accused of borrowing too liberally from the Black Company, and consciously avoided going down the same path as Croker and his compatriots, but it leaves me baffled as to their intentions with further elements of the story. Aside from the aforementioned problems with the scale and stakes of Soulblighter's invasion, I don't quite understand where they were going with the subplot involving the Baron and the corpse robbing. There's a very early trailer for Soulblighter that depicts hooded foes that seem to stand in for the Thrall as foot soldiers of the dark. The only information I was able to find out about these enemies is that they were indeed originally going to replace the Thrall, but were later cut, with their 2D assets released to the modding community later on. It could be that these hooded enemies were meant to make Soulblighter's return a subtler, more gradual build-up, with the iconic Servants of the Dark from the first game only appearing later in Myth 2's campaign, instead of 3 levels in. If that was the intent, I'm not sure what the point was. As far back as when the game was first announced, it was already called Soulblighter, so I can't imagine any veteran players being shocked by the revelation they'd be fighting Fetch, Thrall and Soulless again. So to me, Myth 2's writing disappoints in many areas compared to the original game. It's not as intriguing, it's not as well told, it's not as emotionally resonant, and it's just plain forgettable. A very average entry in a long and distinguished line of generic high fantasy stories. But from another perspective, the banality of Soulblighter's writing does work to some extent in the context of it being both the second and final title in Bungie's Myth series. As we saw earlier, the Fallen Lords had already shot its proverbial load in teasing many people, places and events that were not immediately relevant to its central narrative. To make a follow-up to that, Bungie could have either delivered a direct sequel, as they did with Soulblighter and all the problems that entailed, or they could have maybe set the second game in a completely different place and time. Perhaps the same world, but several thousand years distant from the events of the Fallen Lords. This way, they could have sidestepped having to explain the repercussions of what happened in the original story, but still left subtle hints as to the connections between the two games, as Bungie sometimes did with meta-references to Marathon or Pathways into Darkness in their other games. But this approach would have likely amplified the problems Soulblighter had, the impression that Bungie were deliberately avoiding having to explain things from the first game. This could have dampened interest in whatever they introduced in a second game, since the audience knew at that point anything that wasn't explained in-game was probably never going to be illuminated. And on a more subjective level, I'm personally not sure whether I would have enjoyed another Myth game with the same tone as the first. Myth is certainly haunting and memorable, but I don't know if making 2 rather downbeat and potentially depressing stories in a row is necessary. What people consider an iconic or immutable part of the Myth experience is always going to be subject to debate. Some thought that in-game music was a negative. Bungie, quietly, seemed to have disagreed. The same could be argued of Myth's tone. Myth 2 is more straight-laced and more conventionally satisfying as a narrative, but I can see that as a positive when you position it as a follow-up to the Fallen Lords and a farewell to the series. In Myth, the men of the West and their allies were almost annihilated, and by its conclusion seemed to be barely clinging to survival. Myth 2's opening painted a far less serious picture of their predicament, but then drove them right back to the brink of extinction. For Myth 2 and the series as a whole, to have ended on the same note as the Fallen Lords might have been a little cruel to both the little men on the battlefield and the players themselves. Myth 2's ending, taken at face value at least, suggests a less dire state of affairs than that of the original. It implied a less ominous future for the world, or at least one in which men were masters of their own fate, a philosophy that inspires the journal writer himself to take a new path in life. For Bungie to end their relationship with the series on this much brighter and more optimistic note is appropriate in that sense. Whether Bungie knew at the time they would be permanently abandoning the Myth series, I don't know, but it was a fitting way to part with the franchise and its stories, tying up the core narrative very neatly and opening up the future of the series to the community, to let them try their own ideas and tell their own stories. So, to cap things off, let's have a look at some of the content produced by the Myth community over the years. The initial set of modding tools Bungie released for Myth 2, Tag Editor Fear and Map Editor Loathing, were by themselves enough for fans to get cracking on new content. The earliest mods were naturally the most basic, with players modifying the base attributes to give dwarves nuclear molotovs, dialing the physics up to most ridiculous levels possible, or swapping out units with the map editor. The latter modification, replacing units from the original levels, would go on to become one of the most popular types of mods, since it was a relatively easy way of testing out the new unit types. Some of the earliest single-player mods, for example, were those that swapped out light units for their dark counterparts in the campaign. Some were much more extensively modified than others, with new dialogue, scripts, mission objectives and such to reflect the changes, but in the early days there were some limitations. Bungie obviously didn't release all the tools they themselves had used to develop the game. Aside from professional software used by Bungie's artists and animators, there were also internal tools used specifically for Myth 2, such as the art and geometry editor Amber, and there were elements of Myth's engine that were either hard-coded or not yet fully understood by the modding community. As the modding scene progressed and third-party tools were created to help facilitate more advanced changes, the scale and complexity of mods developed too. Map makers evolved from swapping out or modifying material in the base game to creating totally new content, including new maps, new art, new music and SFX, new multiplayer game modes, and eventually full-scale total conversions. With new opportunities came greater ambitions, and some of these conversions attempted to recreate other popular settings within the Myth 2 engine. Some of these were relatively unproblematic, like those that ported units from Bungie's own Marathon series into Soulblighter, but others were, legally speaking, a little riskier. As illustrated many times over the history of PC gaming, when it comes to mods, some IP holders are far more protective of their assets than others. Mod hosts like The Mill repeatedly warned uploaders to bear in mind that just because a mod was free didn't mean there weren't potential repercussions to hosting it, especially when said mods used visual or audio assets from other games. I remember that at the time, some of these mods were particularly popular due to the lack of officially licensed RTS games in the same settings. There was no Dawn of War in 1999, for example, only turn-based Warhammer 40k titles like Final Liberation, or older Warhammer Fantasy games such as Shadow of the Horned Rat or Dark Omen. Still, there were plenty of modders who were more interested in historical settings or creating original fantasy settings, as Bungie themselves had done. For the purposes of this section, let's divide Soulblighter mods into 3 categories: multiplayer, solo or co-op, and TCs. Now, multiplayer was obviously one of the most popular aspects of Myth 2's modding community, but I've decided to forego covering it here because, like I said earlier, I'm not a multiplayer guy, and whilst both multiplayer and the multiplayer mod scene is absolutely still active, there are a lot of these mods that nobody plays today. So whilst you could set up a game with your friends, it would be a bit pointless for me to go over them. To be clear, that's not a comment on the quality of these mods. Mods like Blue and Grey, or Civil War, Sengoku, World War II Titans, and many others were hugely popular at the time. And some of these aren't multiplayer exclusive. Some have plugins that port the new units to the original single-player campaign, and some have individual co-op or single-player maps. But for this section, I've decided to focus specifically on level packs that are modelled on Myth 2's campaign. That is, they're single player, they have some sort of story and sense of progression, and they're roughly in the style of the base campaign's RTS skirmish level gameplay. That helps narrow things down a bit, and I think is most helpful for new players, who should be able to download and pop these mods into their plugin folders without too much trouble. There are also more ambitious projects, some of which were finished, some of which weren't. There was, for example, the Proof of Concept Chrono Myth mod, which ported a lot of assets from a famous JRPG series into the Myth engine, and even hacked together a sort of semi-turn-based mode. Another example is the Assassin mod, which used some of the assets from the abandoned Daimyo project and reused them to experiment with a stealth-oriented mission. On the subject of Daimyo, I'm not sure whether anything from that project ended up being released to the public outside of Assassin. There are several mods with a similar premise, but Daimyo's creators appear to have been extremely protective of their work. But as I was saying, many of the quirkier mods for Myth 2 are experimental, unfinished, or simply a bit too far from the core gameplay of the Myth series, so I've skipped them even though they may well be very good fun. Another important category I've omitted from this rundown is the Last Stand, or Mazarin's Demise style of single-player map. This type of mod, named after one of the most popular and enduring plugins of its type, is basically a horde mode where the player defends against a seemingly endless army made up of enemies of all shapes and sizes. I've skipped these maps because they're more oriented towards co-op, and don't follow the linear progression model of the single-player campaign. Again, not a comment on their quality, I just wanted to try and focus things a bit. Finally, even after narrowing things down, I didn't cover every single player map pack or custom campaign ever made. It's hard to find up-to-date, curated mod lists that offer new or returning players advice on which single-player mods are a must-play, so whilst I tried to cover all the big names and a few others I found interesting or happened to stumble across, I missed a lot. So take this section of the video as a broad overview of the scene that was done with good intentions, not the word of God on what's worth playing and what isn't. The vast majority of these mods can be downloaded from the Tane website, although I did occasionally run into broken links. So in some cases I found them on the HLUdogs site, the Project Magma site, or the Myth Addicts site. There are a couple of other sites that host these mods, but they went down as I was in the middle of writing this script, so I'm not sure about their current status. Also, in some cases the mods I talk about were lost and then unearthed or uploaded or fixed by third parties, so I apologise for any errors in terms of authorship or when they were released. Don't hesitate to point out any corrections in the comments. To give things a bit of structure, what I'll do next is cover the 4 single-player mods that were featured in Take-Two's Myth 2 Worlds release, as these were at the time the biggest and presumably considered the worthiest contenders for inclusion in a curated single-player mod list. There were other single-player missions in that release, but I never managed to track down a definitive list of what was actually on those 2 discs. Now, Worlds was released in 2001, which was perhaps the peak of activity in the scene, but there were other total conversions and custom campaigns released afterwards, and keep in mind some content was probably left out by Take-Two for legal reasons. So, after covering the big four, I'll talk about some of the other single-player content I played, some of which were released concurrently or prior to Worlds, others many years later. So from the Worlds pack, let's start with Badlands Chimera, released in November 1999. Chimera consists of 8 levels and is much more character-driven than Myth 2's campaign, following the story of 4 grizzled war heroes, who are drawn into a battle with a spiteful sorceress named Corilla. As I mentioned earlier in the video, although Chimera was made by fans, it had some unofficial support from Bungie and Total Audio, so the production values are pretty good for a custom campaign, especially one that came out only a year after the base game. Each level opens with a narrated briefing and some custom art and music, and throughout the in-game action you'll hear a fair bit of new voice work, some of it done by Bungie employees. Chimera's gameplay is very similar to the base game, focusing on skirmish level tactics with a bit of map exploration here and there. The new heroes have some special abilities, like a thunderous power attack that can cleave weaker enemies with a single stroke, and there are a handful of new enemies, like giant wasps, skeleton warriors, and hungry changelings who like to feast on interlopers. Badlands' original commercial pitch to Bungie was much more ambitious, introducing a race of goblins and various other new monsters, as well as the possibility of a mission based around a naval battle. Even in its pared down form, Chimera is sometimes erroneously referred to as an official expansion to Myth 2, partly due to Bungie promoting it themselves, but also because the story is set after Soulblighter's epilogue, though unlike in the original pitch, it doesn't really tie into the main plot at all. I enjoyed Chimera's story and general gameplay, which felt like a natural progression from the end of the base game's campaign. Do keep in mind though that this means the difficulty level assumes you're a veteran player with good knowledge of how to micromanage the basic units and various quirks of the engine. I replayed Myth 2 on Legendary difficulty for this review, and on Normal, Chimera felt as difficult or even harder than that. In an interview, Badlands even jokes about paying a bounty to anyone who sent them a video of completing Chimera on Legendary. If you're not very comfortable playing Myth 2 at the higher difficulty levels, I definitely recommend lowering the difficulty to Simple or Timid, or you will become very frustrated. Even on Normal, I found the second level with the giant wasps, and the final level with the constant spider ambushes really grating, so I wouldn't want to replay those on Legendary. My only other complaint is that the final battle of the campaign is a bit awkwardly scripted, to the point you'd assume it's bugged and is missing some extra dialogue or something, but no, it's working as intended. Overall, a relatively safe campaign that plays more or less the same as Myth 2, albeit with a lot more micromanagement and, more than likely, reloading. It took me about 5 or 6 hours to finish Chimera on normal difficulty, but you could probably do it in a couple of hours on the lowest difficulties if you just want to experience the story. Nothing game-changing, but good enough for people who want more of the same. Our next victim is an early total conversion mod, Bushido, The Way of the Warrior, which was made by the famous Creation Games modding collective and released in December 2000. As you might have guessed from the name, Bushido is somewhat similar to the concept behind the Daimyo project in that it swaps out Myth's mostly medieval Western European setting for 6 levels set in the land of the rising sun. But whereas Daimyo was more focused on historical wargaming, Bushido is more of a fantasy and pop culture inspired take on the period. The new units include a lot of what you'd expect from a Sengoku-style RTS, with Ashigaru spearmen and archers, elite samurai swordsmen, and light cavalry who probably have a proper Japanese term, but I can't bother to look it up in the manual. On top of these stock troops, there are also deadly but impractical rocketeers, elementalists who can summon fireballs and ice storms, cunning and stealthy Tengu who can paralyze or blow up pursuers, and great Oni who can dismember foes with a single swing of their mighty clubs. Bushido centers around the story of Yoshitsune, a swordsman out for revenge against the tyrant Kiyomori of the Taisha. Yoshitsune must rally the people and spirits of the land against the Taisha clan by proving his strength, wisdom, and honor. Bushido is again mostly focused on skirmish level tactics, but has a greater focus than Chimera on single character management, as Creation used the mod to experiment with more advanced scripting techniques. The first level has a couple of light puzzle-esque sections where Yoshitsune must outwit an evil warlock, whilst the later mission features a stealth section. Yoshitsune himself is capable of swapping weapons, so picking up a bow turns him into an archer, whilst picking up a discarded launcher lets him fire a rocket. I think the novelty value of a fantasy Japan is a big draw for Bushido, but I'm sad to say there are a few major issues with the mod. The most important is that Bushido's campaign is very buggy, to the extent that using the version I downloaded from the Tane, only 1 or 2 of the missions can actually be completed. I found a hotfix on the HLUdog site that fixed most of the bugs, but the final level is still glitched. I did try searching for solutions, but the answers I found seem to indicate Bushido is known to be buggy and was never fully fixed. Putting that aside, Bushido is also very difficult, far more punishing than Myth 2 or even Chimera. I think the problem is that, unlike the light and the dark of the base game, Bushido's player and AI units are not asymmetrical in a way that favours the player. In Myth, you were always wildly outnumbered, but it was easier to use your dwarves, warriors and archers to outmaneuver and outthink wights and thralls than vice versa. In Bushido, the 2 single-player factions share very similar units, with the only edge the player has being Yoshitsune and the Tengu. The Tengu are faster than dwarves, but also far less destructive, and most enemy troops run at roughly the same speed as your men, so kiting hordes of enemies is much harder than in the regular game. Some of the features Creation are experimenting with can also be a bit annoying, such as losing control of a unit when they swap weapons, and the fact stealth units still attack without provocation. I did enjoy the final mission, which, once you work around the horrific potential for friendly fire, can be very rewarding when micromanaged effectively, despite the level being impossible to finish. So I can't really recommend Bushido to most people, as not only is it extremely difficult, it's also, to the best of my knowledge, still broken. There are a few caveats to keep in mind though. First is that Bushido was not a purely single player experience. Aside from co-op and such, Bushido's units were also playable in multiplayer mode, where the unit balance probably makes more sense. The second is that Bushido was a total conversion and was pretty ambitious at the time. Some of the things the map makers were experimenting with, like the swappable weapons, were basically jerry-rigged hack jobs of features from the base game that even Bungie themselves hadn't been able to fully implement in time. So if you do decide to try it out, don't be too harsh and manage your expectations considering what the map makers were working with. If you're just interested in the novelty value of the mod, I'd again recommend playing on one of the lower difficulties, which will give you a rough idea of unit balance and new features without causing you to quit out of frustration. There are a couple of other Japanese themed mods out there, but as far as I know they're multiplayer only. Let me know in the comments if I'm mistaken though. The third mod to be featured in the World's release was Jinn by Vista Cartel, which is probably my personal favourite of all the mods for pretty subjective reasons. Released in June 2001, Jinn is another total conversion, this time set upon a desert planet far, far away. The planet is inhabited by 3 major factions: the fanatical Jinn, the Arai Resistance, and the technologically advanced Nassians, who have come to study the planet. After the Jinn launch an unprovoked assault on the Nassians, 2 survivors, Turin and his daughter Biana, fall in with the Arai and try to fight back against the Jinn's roving death squads. Jinn is slightly more zoomed in than the base game, tactically speaking, in that missions always keep the number of units you'll command to very manageable levels, with most averaging around 10 or so. On the player's side, there are sturdy AI shotgunners, long-range laser riflemen, Turin the healer, and Biana the pipe bomber. All of your units have special abilities that will be crucial to survival, such as Biana's finite but extremely powerful mines, or the shotgunner's grenades. Your Jinn pursuers can field large numbers of fanatical Holy Guard, who favour melee, but both sides have a few trump cards to play. There are also numerous sentient creatures, natural or otherwise, roaming the desert, some neutral, others extremely hostile. Levels tend to focus on environmental exploration, with several missions encouraging the player to try and avoid enemy patrols, or solve very simple puzzles like switch hunting or leading enemies into traps. One level involves some light RPG-style interaction with NPCs, with spies gathering intel and conning guards so they can strike at a high-ranking enemy. Jinn isn't especially long, it took me about 4 or 5 hours on the normal difficulty, but I enjoyed it more than something like Chimera due to using slightly different mechanics, and more than something like Bushido due to being less punishing. Apart from the first mission where I was learning the ropes, and the last mission where you're assaulted by an almost never-ending stream of fanatics, I didn't have to resort to save scumming like I did in many other fan campaigns. I read a couple of reviews that found Jinn a bit boring, with one saying the unit mechanics were too similar to the base game. Although Biana is analogous to the dwarf and the rifleman's sort of like the archers, it definitely didn't feel that way when I was playing the missions. It felt like playing a different game to me. Add that to the very different enemy types and extensive use of scripting on each level, and it felt quite novel. There are apparently even a couple of choices you can make that persist into a later mission, though I didn't witness this myself. Still, I'll admit a major reason I enjoyed Jinn so much was the premise. The futuristic post-apocalyptic desert setting really helps it stand out from other fan campaigns, and it seems to draw from a pretty broad array of narrative, mechanical and artistic influences, from sci-fi epics like Dune to B-movie classics like Screamers. Jinn's mission briefings are also somewhat closer to the style of the original myth than they are of Soulblighter or other more conventionally told fan campaigns, in that they're sometimes told out of order or deliberately cryptic, which I noticed some people found off-putting. I personally loved that they went with that approach, as it made the world seem more exotic and alien, and I was genuinely quite invested in where they were going with the story. There used to be a lot of extra material on Jinn's backstory hosted on the Vista Cartel website, but both that and all the sites that mirrored it seem to have gone down, which is a shame. Oddly, though the campaign features new music and voice acting, the narration is not voiced, but I think this actually helped contribute to the sense of mystery. The only major complaint I personally have about Jinn is that it feels like I missed something between the end of the final mission and the epilogue. Not in the positive sense I was talking about earlier, but as if the ending cutscene was missing or something. Doing a little bit of research, that does seem to be the case. It seems like a lot of stuff was cut from Jinn. It left a bit of a sour taste in my mouth after the excellent pre-mission briefings. Another problem that may have been a bug is that I just could not do the stealth mission properly. No matter what I tried, enemy drones would appear out of nowhere and beeline for my force, and I always just had to kill everything on the map. I think it's because Jinn has the same problem as Bushido in that units still automatically try to attack nearby enemies, which is an even bigger problem when you have units with long-range attacks. Based on community reviews from the time, it seems like Jinn was actually a bit of a letdown to some due to being so hyped up in the lead up to release, but nowadays that doesn't seem so relevant. Anyway, the final and most important reason I liked Jinn is that the credit sequence includes a picture of Biana undressing, which automatically wins the mod my highest recommendation. If you only care about honing your vidmaster skills in the crucible of Myth's most challenging fan missions, then Jinn is probably not your thing, but for its style and originality, I think it's worth a playthrough. Of course, if you go by community sentiment, arguably the magnum opus of Soulblighter's modding scene is Creation Games' The Seventh God, which came out in September 2001. TSG might not win points for originality in story or gameplay mechanics, but in scope and scale it's generally agreed to be the biggest and to some, best single-player conversion available. The Seventh God takes place against an all too familiar backdrop of a war for the four kingdoms of men, elves and dwarves. The campaign opens with the invasion of the lands of men by the Goblin Empire, who have used bribery and deceit to recruit the savage Orcan tribes and the warlock king of the Northmen to join in their conquest. Soon the Goblin invaders are burning and killing their way across the four kingdoms in the name of their dark god, and the armies of Thel, Markos, Cincia and Harvek must unite to have a hope of resisting them. The Seventh God campaign includes 18 single-player levels, in which you'll be controlling a variety of staple fantasy troops, including the Stolt Legionaries of the Human Kingdoms, Warlocks of Frost and Fire, and the Archers, Wizards and Forest Guard of the Elves. Your opposition will be in the form of Orcan skirmishers, plus Goblin footmen, Wolf Riders, Elite Imperial Guard, Helots, and the Disciples of the Seventh God. Both factions are reinforced by a handful of units from the base game, but there are also fiercely territorial neutral parties who attack both sides, such as trolls and dragons. The campaign encompasses the same mission types seen in the base game and the aforementioned total conversions, so most levels involve somewhere between 15 to 20 troops, focusing on exploration, search and destroy, or holding actions. But there are also a couple of special missions where a small group of heroes strike at the heart of the enemy, or spies infiltrating Goblin headquarters. The basic unit types don't take long to get to grips with. They're the typical warriors, archers, wizards and healers of the base game, but learning the nuances of magic units are absolutely essential to success. Elven wizards, for example, have an attack that blows arrows or other projectiles off course, and can even cause spells cast by other units to go off prematurely. Similarly, the Frost Warlock's attack will slow units for several seconds, but can also be detonated for extra damage. You'll find it very difficult to progress in the Seventh God if you don't make extensive use of these overlapping unit abilities. Most levels are also very heavily scripted and involve multiple sub-objectives, so it's important to understand what you're supposed to be doing and where you're meant to be going at different stages of these missions. Making use of the local wildlife in these maps is also pretty much mandatory in normal difficulty, as you'll need to minimise casualties to your own forces whilst leading enemy formations into ambushes by trolls and the like. After the Bungie-backed Chimera, the Seventh God is probably the most famous project to come out of the community, and is widely considered an unmissable experience for anyone who enjoyed Myth 2. Whilst you certainly can't fault creation for effort, for my part I had a mixed experience with the campaign. First, I encountered a couple of bugs, one mild and one a bit more serious. The first occurred when one of the level scripts got a bit tangled and failed to trigger an enemy assault, though I was able to bypass this by just methodically killing everything on the map. The second bug prevented me from completing the mission and had to be fixed by using the automatic victory cheat. I watched a playthrough of this campaign from several years ago by Myth fan channel Jioku, and it looks like they ran into both that bug and a few others I didn't experience. Doesn't appear to be a major issue, just be aware these things might crop up. The other problem I had with the campaign is entirely subjective, but I thought the difficulty level was far too high at the default level. I spent something like 70% of the campaign in quarter speed mode or paused, but there was just such an insane level of micromanagement involved I don't think I would have been able to pass some of the levels otherwise. The level hints specifically tell you to use the mage to detonate enemy spells prematurely, for example, but this is something you could very easily mistime, and doesn't fall under the relatively gentle RNG of, say, dwarf Molotovs in the base game. I can understand this being necessary at the higher difficulty levels, where even in the original game you have to exploit the enemy's AI, but I don't think it should be so important to rely on this on the default difficulty. It reminded me of old magazines criticising the Myth series for having tedious stop and start gameplay, where you have to keep pausing and micromanaging everything, which I don't think is an entirely fair criticism of the Fallen Lords or Soulblighter on normal, but definitely applies to the Seventh God. One level even warns players that if they're playing on normal or above, they should have pre-existing knowledge of exactly when and where the next enemy wave is going to come from, which seems to me contrary to the purpose of having a default difficulty level. It's definitely not the hardest fan campaign out there, but in a 14-hour campaign that's a bit of a grind sometimes. I also feel like a few levels accentuate some of the more general weaknesses of the Myth engine, like the defense of a dwarven mountain, where the awkward elevation means the AI is functionally incapable of leading targets properly. Or even worse, a level where you have to defend a tiny space against hordes of goblin elites, controlling units who keep blocking each other, firing into their friends' backs, or shooting into 3D models that their AI doesn't seem capable of registering. There was evidence of these weaknesses in some of Soulblighter's more ambitious levels, like the Baron's Keep or the Fortress at White Falls, but creation seem to have let themselves get carried away and built entire levels around scenarios that just don't work all that well in Myth. Another symptom of map makers gone wild is creating every campaign map to work in both single player and co-op, which means the pre-level instructions are sometimes overcomplicated with warnings about doing this or not doing this, depending on whether you're playing solo or not. Criticisms aside, I did like the story in The Seventh God. Admittedly, from the description it does sound extremely formulaic as fantasy wars go, but it's a story that's told well enough both in-game and via the mission briefings, thanks to its gravelly voiced narrator.
Tonight, Marcon will be the second city-state to fall. The flag of the Empire will fly over the Castle Markov.
If you enjoy fantasy war stories in the vein of, say, Raymond E. Feist's Krondor books, then The Seventh God's writing is good for what it is. It's not as unique or otherworldly as Jinn, but there are a few clever little twists and some vague references to the events of Myth's story. According to some posts I read on the Tane forums, it was supposed to represent the other side of the coin to Myth's world, or something like that. So overall, worth playing, just keep in mind it's not going to be much fun on normal difficulty if you don't like a lot of micromanagement and making 30 different save files per level. For that crowd, I think it's better to play the campaign on one of the easiest 2 settings. That wraps up what's sometimes called the Big Four of the single-player map-making scene, but as I said, there are plenty of others worth mentioning, so I'll run through those in no particular order. Let's start with Legend of Gorash, made by Creation Games and released in May 2000, which was pretty well known back when I played Myth 2, but seems to have been overshadowed since. Logar puts you in control of the savage Brianor tribesmen, who briefly debuted in Soulblighter's campaign, and focuses on the tale of the tribal legend Gorash and his war against the Furbolg. There are 3 or 4 missions in this campaign, which on normal difficulty took me around an hour or 2 to finish in total. And aside from the regular Brianor and Wolf units from the base game, you'll also control Brianor Shaman, a couple of hero units, and the ponderous but powerful changelings. The Furbolg also gets several new units in addition to the original bowmen, including spearmen, sword and board warriors, and even griffins. As with a lot of Creation's releases, this definitely feels balanced and playtested for Myth veterans, but I personally didn't find it as brutal as the Seventh God, if only because it's only a few levels. There are some annoyances, like your Brianor constantly hitting each other in the back, something they also did in the original campaign. And I read 1 or 2 reviews say they didn't like playing as the bad guys in this campaign, which I can kind of understand since fighting against unfavourable odds feels more worthwhile when it's for a good cause. But if that doesn't bother you, I think there's a fair mix of both challenge and good old cathartic carnage to be found in Gorash. It also has a special theme tune that got caught in my head for a week afterwards. Gorash himself, or a slightly less intimidating version, crops up in another Creation map series called The Coming of the Dark. Released in 3 parts, starting with the COD level pack in '99 and ending with Banks of the Ire in 2001, this is a mostly cherry vanilla experience in that it's set during the events of the Fallen Lords and the majority of units are just recycled from the original campaigns. The level pack, which in my opinion is the best part of the mod, features 3 levels, including a race to rescue a stranded emissary, defending against a combined Brianor and undead army, and finally holding off several waves of undead during a blizzard at Bagrada. The difficulty level of these 3 missions is only slightly higher than that of the Bungie levels, and there's a nice bit of variety to them, particularly the Emissary mission, which lets you control the amphibious Scrael, who are cut from the original Fallen Lords campaign. Leading pirates and undead into each other's path is great fun. The latter 2 levels, Source of the 500 Poisons and Banks of the Ire, are longer but in my opinion not as fun, as the first is a very linear trek through some caverns whilst watching out for traps, and the latter is an unbelievably long last stand mission against something like 500 plus enemies. I recorded about an hour of footage from the latter mission and then got bored, then spent about another 30 minutes finishing it to see whether anything interesting happened. Spoiler warning, it didn't. It also seems to use some of the mechanics of the original Myth, meaning the Furbolg archers, which use custom models and have inexplicably long attack animations, love killing themselves and their allies with stray arrows. I think it would have been less of a slog if it was a bit more story-driven, in that different waves were preceded by cutscenes or some sort of mini-boss, or ended with an attack by a Fallen Lord, but nothing like that happens, at least on normal difficulty. I think it's definitely worth playing the 3 mission pack levels if you like the basic gameplay of the Myth series, but the last 2 missions are maybe more for completionists. Another mission pack that initially falls into the cherry vanilla category is Cartographers of Myth's The Great War campaign, which appeared in, I think, January 2002, and starts off based on events mentioned but never depicted in the original Myth. This pack includes 7 maps that cover a fair variety of gameplay, including a stealth level and a quite cleverly scripted rescue and escort mission. All the units are taken from the original games, and the tactics you'll be using essentially the same as well. The Great War is unfortunately a beta release based on a much grander attempt at a total conversion, so the first half of the campaign seems fairly polished and consistent, but then the story veers into some sort of parody or meta humour and the levels start to break down, first losing background music and then in-game content. The 6th mission is unfinished and the final level basically a placeholder. Even so, the first 4 or 5 levels are pretty close to the quality of the original campaign, and although there's nothing new, they might be worth playing for those who want more of the classic experience. If you were looking for a shorter but more consistent Cherry Vanilla experience, it's also worth playing Nightfall by the mapmakers Renaissance, which is a 2-mission sequence set during the events of Myth 2. Playing as the 7th Legion, the player has to escape a trap set by Soulblighter, then rush to defend a crossroads from oncoming hordes. The second map starts where the first left off, and has you charge through the retreating enemies and launch an assault on a dark figure from the past. Nightfall is a very challenging experience on normal difficulty, but it's also well polished and a good test of how well you know your tactics from the original games. Less polished, but definitely worth mentioning, is the Lost Kingdoms by Carlinho. This mod was an attempt to salvage an abandoned total conversion project, and though not fully completed, the plugin includes 4 playable solo levels. Lost Kingdoms is one of surprisingly few Soulblighter mods to feature the warriors of the ancient world. Instead of warlocks and journeymen, you'll command hoplites, peltasts, Cretan archers, war dogs, and priests. And rather than thrall and fetch, your enemies will be the armies of Persia and their allies, including spearmen, horse archers, and Indian war elephants. Although these levels use some placeholder assets here and there, and the scripting isn't entirely finished, you can still progress through the missions, which include trekking through crocodile-infested rivers, seizing and defending a mountain temple, exploring a mythical isle, and weathering a full-scale siege. I couldn't quite work out the best unit dynamics to reduce casualties, and there are some odd mechanics in the map, like Terminator wildlife, but it's an impressive achievement nonetheless, and it would be awesome if someone came back to this conversion and tried to finish it off properly. Another impressive and very recent mod is Might and Magic Myth, which came out January 2022 and was made by Lone Wolf Creations, who I think are a Russian or Anglo-Russian group. Lone Wolf have quite a few single-player map packs under their belt, such as Siege of Belmont and Shards of the Ermine, but it seemed like Might and Magic Myth was the one most worth covering. As you might have guessed, M&M Myth is a total conversion that lets you play as 4 unique factions from the classic role-playing and strategy franchise Might and Magic. There's a tutorial and 4 single-player levels in which you command the Castle, Tower, Necropolis, or Dungeon factions. Numerous iconic units from the Heroes games are featured in the mod, many of which have special abilities, such as the Medusae and their petrifying gaze, or the Titans and their lightning strike. Although the mission objectives are fairly typical of vanilla Myth levels, the mod uses a lot of features otherwise seen only in the modding community, or utilising the features of Project Magma's upgraded Soulblighter engine. Expect to see lots of environmental destruction, some side quests, and even a basic inventory system so units can make use of multiple collectible items. Although the mod makes extensive use of assets from the Might and Magic series, like a couple of other Lone Wolf projects I tried, it also seems to use machine text-to-speech for some of its voice acting, which is a bit distracting in my opinion.
We need to get to the fortress before the main force of the Niggans show up.
Still, that and a few minor bugs only slightly detract from the beautiful art and music that brings the world of Enroth to life. Based on some comments made by the authors, it seems like the mod entered production years ago, in 2015 I think, and was meant to include 4 or 5 distinct campaigns for each race. But after realising the amount of work involved, the project was scaled down. Each mission takes about 30 minutes to complete, so it's not the longest of campaigns, but it keeps things interesting by letting you play around with several new unit types each level. Of course, as I'm sure you're sick of hearing me say by now, it's substantially harder than the base game, and if you don't want to be doing a lot of pausing and reloading, you should play on one of the easiest difficulty levels. I read a very negative review on the Tane, where it was argued that Lone Wolf had been too wrapped up in the scope of the mod to think about the gameplay. Whilst this is somewhat true, it again lacks the asymmetrical balance of Myth's light versus dark from the player's perspective, and it can be a bit tedious due to the difficulty. I also don't see how that's any different from most of the single player mods I've mentioned in this video. So though you might argue Might and Magic Myth is more style than substance, I still think it's worth trying. Finally, if well-known properties don't interest you, there's Creation's Sisters of the Blade TC, which uses its own original fantasy setting and follows the journey of Trin, a young initiate in a holy order of Templars. The campaign opens with Trin afflicted by strange and prophetic dreams that her superiors believe a symptom of light-headedness, so they let her join a routine patrol to clear her head. Trin and her fellows are ambushed by the Grey Circle, a mercenary group of outlaw wizards, bandits and monsters, and Trin survives only through the intervention of the monstrous Dowd. Trin journeys into the blasted heartlands of the Skadi Wildman, where she discovers that both she and her sisters have been betrayed. Sisters of the Blade contains 4 levels, which should take around 30 minutes each on normal difficulty, and are only slightly harder than those in the original campaign. All the units in this conversion are new, with the Order fielding spell-slinging paladins and warrior nuns, the Grey Circle made up of beastly footpads, nimble scouts, dagger-throwing assassins and mischievous smoke weavers, and the Skadi, a confederation of agile scouts, brutish fighters, and lightning-wielding shaman. There's nothing too surprising as far as gameplay and mission design go, just some gimmicks like enemies who can create decoys of themselves. But it's all competently done, and on top of all the new art, it features new music and voice acting. I had to replay the last part of the final mission a couple of times due to scripting bugs, but other than that I have no major complaints. Nowhere as daring as a project like The Seventh God, but if you want a reasonably quick high fantasy jaunt in the Myth engine, it should be to your tastes. And to round everything off, there are several other map packs I experimented with but didn't play all the way through, so I'll briefly summarise each of those. The first is Freedom, which is a fairly standard set of missions with the charming twist of being worked on by the map maker's young niece and nephew, something you'll quickly realise based on the art, writing and voice work.
That's a silly plan. I wonder how you berserks managed to live this long. Enough arguing! I say we go to a moon.
Okay then.
Obviously more a passion project made with the best intentions rather than a 100% serious work, but I feel like it deserves inclusion in the video for earnestness alone. The second mission set is Phantom Hound's Call of Glory by Onyx Warlords. This consists of 3 missions set during the events of the Fallen Lords, and features a few new enemies, most notably the Undead Dirigible, another unit that was cut from the original Myth. These maps seem to be very well made and have some interesting ideas, like defending a fort whilst sending out troops to flank and capture the enemies, or a running battle with hordes of explosive undead. But they're also extremely punishing, sometimes spawning enemies right under your feet. I lost interest after messing around with them for about an hour, but Onyx apparently made a follow-up campaign called Haunted Heart, so more dedicated hardcore players must have enjoyed them. Another project I tried out was Year of the Burning Stone by Naraoya, which includes 5 levels set in the aftermath of the destruction of the Cathbroig Empire. The plot follows the Heron Guards as they transition into the journeymen we all know and love, and has some memorable sequences, like the nightmarish blood-soaked ruins of Muirthemne, haunted by crimson ghosts. Unfortunately, I couldn't really work out how to make the best use of journeymen and Heron Guards when facing groups of enemies, especially Crimson Dwarves, and when I took a gander at later levels they looked like they were unfinished or placeholder, so I think the mod was abandoned after its original release. From what I gather, it was made as part of a map-making competition, so that would make sense. The final mission pack I started but didn't continue is Under Mirkridian Standards by Soma, Kuba and Bubba. This 4-level pack jumps back about 1,000 years to the Wind Age, covering the coming of the Leveler and the rise of the hero Connaught. I played a bit of this mod but didn't really enjoy the tactical dynamic of the units you're given in these levels, and the mod itself is sort of a proof of concept that was never expanded upon, so the story is kind of unfinished. To be honest, I probably would have continued playing it were it not for the fact that it covers very similar material to another big mod. That mod is Knights of the Golden Circle's Myth 3 Public Beta, or Myth 2 The Wolf Age, depending on the version. This project is an attempt to remake the campaign of Mumbo Jumbo's Myth 3 in the upgraded Myth 2 engine. This is a massive endeavour, as you can guess from the file size, and it might seem strange I omitted it from this retrospective. But I decided since I should be covering Myth 3 one day, I might as well leave this mod for that video as an interesting point of comparison. And those are all the single player map packs or total conversions that I personally put time into. As I said earlier, I know I missed quite a few, like Lego My Myth, Green Berets, the Civil War campaign, and several others I've shown footage of, but hopefully those of you who've never played Myth 2 are aware of the heavy hitters, and people who checked out of the community in the early 2000s have learned about a few of the more recent or less well-known mods. So if you worked on or played other interesting Soulblighter mods, especially active multiplayer TCs that I didn't talk about, then as always, please do share in the comments.
So, they finally toppled the mad, deadly, worldwide gangster communist Frankenstein computer god.
As a general rule, I try to avoid covering straightforward sequels on this channel because, trust me, going over the same points again is just as boring for me as it is for you. And I'll admit this video has fallen foul of this in places, as it's hard to avoid the fact that Myth 2 looks and plays pretty much exactly the same as the first game. And Bungie were aware of this. Jason Jones, the original lead on the Fallen Lords, moved on from the series because he was so excited about making the next big thing. And that next big thing was supposed to be Blam, Myth's groundbreaking sci-fi spiritual successor, a new frontier for RTS that perhaps would have been the basis for a Myth 3, assuming Bungie returned to it afterwards. Blam, or Project Monkey Nuts, or Project Armor, or whatever its final name, would have been a fascinating thing to see, and a Myth 3 based on that engine equally so. But as we all know, Myth was not followed up with a spiritual successor. Instead, it was outshone by a first-person shooter, and then tossed to Take-Two as a consolation prize after the Microsoft deal. In an alternate reality where Blam, the sci-fi spiritual successor to Myth, went down in history as the RTS that revolutionised the genre, Myth 2 probably would have been that safe, unassuming interquel everyone kind of forgot about. For the purposes of this video, replaying it and reading comments from contemporary reviews, there were some points worth mentioning, in how it tried to fix the issues of the original title, how it tried to keep things fresh, and in how the real-time strategy landscape had changed over the course of its 9-month development cycle. And playing some of the more difficult mods also gave me a greater appreciation for criticisms levelled at both the Fallen Lords and Soulblighter. I can certainly understand how some players found the unit control and friendly fire to be a deal breaker, as this wasn't a major issue for me in the original games, but became quite a drag in some of the mods. But really it was fan-made campaigns such as those that convinced me that Soulblighter, for all its conservatism in other areas, was worth making a video on in the first place. Its gameplay innovations, if it can be said to have any, may not be as interesting to talk about as those introduced by the first game, but its map-making tools certainly were. More than one developer has tried to engender a modding scene around their games, but not all have been successful. I think among the most important factors you need for a healthy, user-created content community are that the game itself is reasonably good, that the tools are reasonably stable and user-friendly, and that you give some level of support to the community. Several high-profile developers have violated at least one of these rules, releasing overly complicated or unwieldy modding tools, releasing them too late after the game's release, or making the game itself unnecessarily hostile to custom content due to issues with launchers or anti-piracy features. I don't think anyone can guarantee a game will have a vibrant modding scene, but Bungie at least covered all of the aforementioned points, and a vibrant modding scene is exactly what they got. To me, Soulblighter is a little disappointing when held up next to the original game. It just doesn't have the same despairingly beautiful atmosphere as the Fallen Lords. It feels like just another game, rather than an experience. But were it not for Myth 2, the first game would probably be one of those many titles of the era that caused a small sensation at the time, but was soon carried away downstream like so much driftwood. Soulblighter didn't just satisfy fans of the first game, but enabled and empowered them. It doesn't really matter how many of those fans actually went on to make award-winning total conversions or secure a career in games development. What matters is that it introduced many of them to the wonderful act of creation, be it new units, new maps, or whole new narrative-driven campaigns. I'm sure there's a huge group of Soulblighter fans who never published a single plugin, but spent dozens or perhaps hundreds of hours mucking about with the tools, and they were hours well spent. So it's sad that, more than 20 years later, Myth 2 isn't as accessible to audiences as it should be. Let's hope that someday we'll see Soulblighter up on digital distribution sites, and that the modding hosts I've mentioned in this video are still up and running. If you're interested in learning more about Soulblighter, or are a returning fan interested in reconnecting with the game or its community, as of writing, the Tane forums are still actively monitored. There's a small subreddit dedicated to the series, and there's also the Meerguard Discord channel, where, when not posting memes, they appear to occasionally discuss the series and organise multiplayer matches. If you're interested in watching more Myth content, have a look at Gyoku's channel, who has LPs of the Myth games and numerous single-player mods, as well as lengthy videos on Myth's story and background lore. Try not to spoil yourself too much though, as I would like to cap the series off with a video on Mumbo Jumbo's Myth 3, The Wolf Age, probably around the same time next year. But that brings us to the end of today's journey, so I'll let you all get back to whatever it was you were supposed to be doing instead of wasting time on my videos. Once again, a big thanks to everyone watching and those who are subscribed to my channel. I really appreciate all your comments. As for the channel, it's been a while since I covered any retro adventure games, so the next video will be on the shareware point-and-click gothic horror love story, Romantic Blue. See you next time, everyone.